The wind came wrong that night. It blew from the east, where no wind should blow, carrying neither the smoke of Mordor nor the dust of the Rimuru. The trees in Fangorn felt it first. Ancient roots that had weathered the music of Yavanna herself hesitated as if the earth beneath them had forgotten for one breath how to be earth. The Ents stirred in their slow dreaming and found no words in any tongue-root speech or otherwise for what they sensed. In Lothlorien, a single Malern leaf fell out of season. Galadriel caught it before it touched the silver grass. She did not speak, but her eyes turned eastward, and those who knew her well enough to read the stillness of her face found no comfort there. Gandalf the Grey, walking the borders of the Shire in those days, before the shadow grew long enough to darken, even that green land stopped on the road. His staff, which had guided him through darker paths than most could imagine, trembled in his hand. Not with fear, with recognition of something that should not be recognized. He looked up at the stars and found them precisely where they ought to be burning, with the light Varda had set in the deeps of time. Yet for a span no longer than a held breath, they had flickered. The world had skipped a note in its song, far to the east beyond the concerns of hobbits and the watchfulness of wizards. Beyond even the malice that festered in Barad-dûr, the air itself bent around an absence. Not darkness, not light. Simply a place where the music that had sung Arda into being found itself, joined by a melody it had never written. The shape that fell into that emptiness was small. Translucent blue like water, caught in the moment before it decides to become ice. No limbs to speak of. No face by which intent could be read. It settled onto barren stone with neither sound nor ceremony. A droplet of something that did not belong to the vocabulary of creation, as the Ainur had composed it. For a long moment nothing moved. Then the wind remembered its direction, and the world resumed its turning. And those who had felt the wrongness in that pause convinced themselves it had been imagination. All except those whose eyes were not easily fooled. Tom Bombadil found the visitor before dawn. He came singing, as he came to all things, his words tumbling over each other in a rhythm that cared nothing for sense and everything for joy. The blue shape, already beginning to learn that this world expected forms more definite than fluid suggestion, had taken a vaguely spherical consistency, resting in a shallow depression of weathered granite. Tom stopped singing. This in itself was remarkable. Those who knew Tom, and few truly did, understood that his silence was rarer than dragon gold and considerably more precious. He crouched down, his bright eyes, studying the visitor with an interest that held neither fear nor worship. His hands, which had held the ring itself and felt nothing of its weight, hovered above the blue surface without quite touching. "Well now," he said, and his voice had lost its dancing lilt. "Well now, here's a puzzle and no mistake. A drop from the wrong rain, a note from the wrong song." He tilted his head, considering. The river doesn't ask the stone why it's there. The stone doesn't ask the river where it's going. But you little blue wanderer, you're asking both questions without saying a word. The shape rippled, though there was no wind to disturb it. Something that might have been curiosity, or might have been confusion, or might have been the first stirring of awareness that the rules had changed. Tom nodded as if a great truth had been confirmed. The music plays on, and even the notes that fall between the measures have their place. But mind you this. He leaned closer, and for a moment his face held an expression that would have troubled even the wise had they been there to see it. A note can fill a silence, or it can break a song. Sing soft step light, and don't you go binding this world with iron, no matter how bright you polish it. He stood brushing dust from his knees that had never been there, and resumed his walking song as if nothing of consequence had occurred. His voice faded into the pre-dawn gray, something about stones and stars, and the way rivers remember their names. The blue shape remained where it had fallen, but something in its stillness had changed, as if it had heard. as if it understood that understanding itself would not be enough. In the days that followed, a rumor began among those who paid attention to rumors of the wrong sort, not spread by the enemy, though his servants heard it and grew uneasy without knowing why. A whisper that somewhere in the wildlands something had arrived that answered to no name in the long histories of Arda. Neither servant of the shadow nor messenger of the west. Simply present the way a stone is present in a river, changing the flow without intending malice or mercy. Gandalf heard the rumor from a ranger who had heard it from a woodsman who had heard it from the wind, which is the least reliable witness and sometimes the most truthful. The wizard said nothing, but he changed his path. He no longer walked the Shire's borders. He turned east toward the wildlands, toward the place where the music had stuttered. In Rivendell, Elrond read the stars with an attention he had not needed since the last alliance. The patterns were correct. The seasons turned as they should. Yet something in the order of things had shifted, the way a harp string shifts when the peg is turned by a hand too careful to be heard, but too deliberate to be ignored. "We should send riders to Glorfindel," Glorfindel said, reading the stillness in his lord's face. "No," Elrond replied. His voice carried the weight of ages and the weariness of one who has seen too many certainties collapse beneath the simple fact of time. "If this thing means us harm, riders will not stop it. If it does not, we will learn its purpose when purpose reveals itself. The world is old, Glorfindel, but it is not yet so old that it cannot surprise us." But he did not look away from the east, where something that should not exist had nonetheless chosen to exist anyway. In the hollow where it had first fallen, the blue shape learned. Not with words for words were a thing this world used differently than the one it had left. Not with analysis for the voice that had once catalogued and calculated had gone silent, or perhaps simply changed its language to something that felt more like instinct than instruction. It learned that stone had weight and history, that air carried more than breath, that light here did not simply illuminate, but testified, bearing witness to the fact of things. It learned that this world was not a system to be optimized, but a song still being sung, and that every element of that song, from the least pebble to the greatest mountain, knew its part. Most importantly, it learned that it did not know its own part. Not yet. The shape drew itself together, pulling coherence from formlessness. Not because coherence was necessary for survival. Survival here seemed to operate on principles it did not fully grasp, but because this world expected shapes, expected boundaries, expected things to declare themselves one way or another. When the form settled, it resembled a figure caught between childhood and something beyond childhood. Slender, androgynous, with hair that held the color of moonlight on water, and eyes that gleamed with an amber warmth that had no source in Middle-earth's long memory. The garments that materialized were simple, neither rich nor ragged. The kind of clothing that makes no statement because it needs to make none. The figure stood testing the weight of having weight, testing the sensation of ground beneath feet of air against skin. Everything felt both familiar and utterly foreign, as if remembered from a dream that had happened to someone else. A voice spoke not from the throat, but from somewhere deeper. A whisper that carried no words, but held the cadence of caution. The figure Rimuru. Though that name meant nothing here, and would mean nothing for some time, yet turned slowly, taking in the landscape. Barren stone, distant mountains, a sky that stretched with a vastness that suggested both freedom and immense patient watchfulness. No cities, no structures that spoke of the civilizations this shape remembered building, protecting, nurturing into something better than they had been. Just stone and sky and the slow certainty that this world would not be changed by force, no matter how great that force might be. Rimuru stood alone in the wildlands, a note that had fallen into the wrong song, and waited. Not for instruction, not for purpose. Simply waited the way a river waits for the stone to teach it a new path. The sun rose over Middle-earth, indifferent and absolute, and the shadow in the east stirred without yet knowing what had entered the world to oppose it. But the world knew. The deep roots knew. The stones knew. And in their slow, patient way, they prepared themselves for the stranger who would walk among them, neither enemy nor savior. But something the music had not anticipated and could not perhaps afford to ignore. The note had fallen. Now the song would decide what to do with it. Rivendell had stood for 3,000 years as a refuge against the darkness. And in all that time its halls had witnessed councils both grave and desperate. But the gathering that assembled in the Hall of Fire on that autumn evening carried a weight that even Elrond, who had seen the fall of kingdoms and the passing of ages, found difficult to name. The representatives had come from across Middle-earth, dwarves from the lonely mountain, their beards braided with silver clasps that caught the firelight. Elves of the woodland realm, standing with the stillness of birches before a storm. Men from Gondor, their faces marked by the long watching of an enemy that never slept. And at the center of it all, a creature that belonged to none of these categories, whose very presence seemed to bend the air around it, like light through water. Rimuru sat, if sitting was the right word, for the way the figure rested on the stone bench apart from the others. Not by choice, but by the simple fact that no one had quite known where to place something that defied placement. The form was human enough, slight androgynous, with features that suggested youth without claiming it. But the eyes gave the lie to any assumption of innocence. They held an amber depth that spoke of vastly more than the short weeks since the figure's arrival in Middle-earth. Gandalf stood near the fire, his gray robes seeming to drink the light rather than reflect it. He had been the first to find Rimuru, after Tom Bombadil's cryptic encounter, tracking rumors and whispers until he stood face to face with something he could not categorize. The wizard's eyes had not left the newcomer since the council began, and those who knew him well recognized the expression he wore when contemplating a problem that had too many answers and not enough questions. Elrond rose, and the murmur of conversation died as if cut by a blade. The Lord of Rivendell wore his authority lightly, but it was no less absolute for its gentleness. His gaze swept the assembly before settling on Rimuru, with an intensity that had judged the hearts of kings and found them wanting. "We have gathered to speak of the enemy's growing power." Elrond began his voice, carrying the measured cadence of one who chooses each word with the care of a craftsman selecting stones for a foundation. "But before we turn to that darkness, we must address the stranger in our midst. One who came unlooked for, uncalled, and bearing a nature that even the wise cannot fully discern. A dwarf Glawn, his name, was father of one who would later walk darker paths than any in that hall could imagine shifted uncomfortably. If we cannot discern its nature, perhaps it should not be here to witness our counsels. And yet here it sits," said a voice like silver bells cast in a minor key. Galadriel stepped forward from where she had stood in shadow, and even in that company of the great and noble, her presence commanded attention. Her eyes, which had looked upon the light of the trees before the sun and moon, were made fixed upon Rimuru with an expression that held neither welcome nor rejection, only an immense patient curiosity. Here it sits, and the world has not ended. The ring has not claimed it. Mordor has not gained a new servant. So perhaps the question is not what it is, but what it intends. Rimuru met her gaze without flinching. And in that moment, those watching saw something that troubled them more than fear would have. The figure showed no awe, no overwhelm at standing before the daughter of Finarfin, the bearer of Nenya, one of the eldest and mightiest of the Eldar. Just a calm, measuring attention that suggested neither arrogance nor humility, but something outside the framework of either. "I intend nothing for your world," Rimuru said, and the voice carried an accent that belonged to no tongue spoken in Middle-earth, yet somehow remained comprehensible. "I did not choose to come here. I do not seek to rule it. I seek only to understand it, and perhaps to help if help is needed and wanted." "Pretty words," said Gluan, though his tone suggested he found them anything but. "The enemy also claims benevolent intent, offers gifts, promises aid, and those who accept find themselves bound before they recognize the chains. The dwarf speaks wisdom born of bitter experience," Gandalf said. And for the first time since the council began, he moved closer to Rimuru. The wizard's staff tapped against stone with each step a rhythm that might have been random, but somehow felt deliberate. "The question is not whether you mean harm now, but whether you could be turned to harm later. The ring that brought us to this council has a way of making the well-intentioned into instruments of ruin." Rimuru's expression shifted. Something that might have been the ghost of a smile or the echo of sorrow. "I have been offered power before. Told that if I only seized it, used it, shaped the world to better purposes, all would be well. I have learned that power which demands to be used is power that should be refused. Then why come here at all?" Elrond's question cut through the debate like a knife finding flesh. "If you seek neither power nor purpose, why does your presence trouble the very fabric of this world? The stars themselves marked your arrival. The ancient places stirred. You cannot claim to be without significance when your mere existence disrupts the order of things." For a long moment, Rimuru did not answer. The figure's gaze turned inward, and those watching saw a struggle play out behind amber eyes. When the words came, they carried a weight that had not been there before. "I am significant in a world that does not want my significance. I am capable in a world that does not need my capability. And I am here whether the music wrote a place for me or not." The voice remained steady, but something in its timbre suggested a cost to that steadiness. "But I learned long ago that the strongest choice is not to act, but to know when action would do more harm than good. If this world needs me to be nothing more than a witness, then I will witness. If it needs me to leave, then I will find a way to leave. But I will not become what Mordor is, no matter how much faster that would end the suffering." Silence fell over the hall, broken only by the crackling of the fire. It was Galadriel who moved first, crossing the space between herself and Rimuru, with a grace that made the movement seem less like walking, and more like the world rearranging itself to accommodate her will. "Come," she said, extending a hand. "You speak of choices and restraint. Let us see if your heart matches your words." Rimuru stood, and those who had fought in wars, who had seen the clash of armies and the fall of towers, later swore they felt something shift in that moment. Not a threat, not a promise, simply a recognition that what stood before them operated on scales they could not quite measure. Galadriel led Rimuru from the hall, and Gandalf followed, and the rest of the council watched them go, with expressions ranging from relief to apprehension to simple, profound uncertainty. They walked in silence through Rivendell's gardens, where even in autumn, the flowers held their color with a defiance born of elven craft. Galadriel brought them to a stone basin, ancient beyond reckoning, filled with water that caught the starlight and held it like captured songs. "This is my mirror," Galadriel said, her voice soft, but edged with something that might have been warning. "It shows many things. Things that were things that are, and some things that have not yet come to pass. But for those who look with clouded purpose, it shows only the reflection of their own desires." "You want to test me," Rimuru said. "It was not a question. I want to understand you," Galadriel corrected. "The ring I bear grants me insight into hearts and minds, but yours remains opaque. So instead I offer you a choice. Look into the mirror. See what it shows you. And in your reaction, perhaps we will both learn something true." Gandalf said nothing, but his hand rested on his staff with the ready tension of one prepared to act should action become necessary. Rimuru approached the basin slowly, and for the first time since arriving in Middle-earth, something like hesitation showed in the figure's movements. At the water's edge, the figure paused. "What if I see something I cannot ignore? Then you will have to choose whether to act or to refrain," Galadriel replied. "As all who hold power must choose every day until the choice becomes easier, or they become the thing they fought against." Rimuru looked into the mirror. The water showed a vision of fire. Not the clean fire of a hearth or forge, but the consuming fire of war. Mordor's armies sweeping across the land, leaving ash and silence in their wake. Cities falling, forests burning. The free people scattered and broken, hunted through their own lands by an enemy that would not stop until every trace of resistance had been ground to dust. And in the center of it all, a small figure bearing a golden ring, stumbling through darkness toward a mountain that blazed with malice. The vision shifted. Now it showed Rimuru no longer small and uncertain, but vast. A presence that rewrote the rules of reality with casual thought. The armies of Mordor simply ceased to exist, not destroyed but unmade, as if they had never been. The Dark Tower fell not in ruin, but in silence, its stones forgetting they had ever been stacked. The ring itself dissolved like morning mist, its powers scattered to winds that would never gather it again. And Middle-earth lived, safe, peaceful, perfect, except for the eyes of those who survived. They looked at their savior with expressions that held no gratitude, only fear, and the slow, terrible understanding that they had traded one Dark Lord for another, even if this one smiled and called itself friend. Rimuru jerked back from the mirror as if struck. The figure's hands trembled the first time since arriving in this world, that the calm had cracked enough to show what lay beneath. "I could do it," Rimuru whispered, and the words held a horror born not of impossibility, but of terrible, certain capability. "I could end this, all of it. Make it so the war never happens. Make it so people never have to choose between dying free or living in chains." "Yes," Galadriel said simply. "You could. Just as I could were I to claim the ring. Just as Gandalf could were he to abandon his purpose and seize power for himself. The question is not capability, it is will." Gandalf stepped forward, and his voice when he spoke was gentler than it had been in the council hall. "The enemy offers the same bargain you know. Submit, and you need never fear again. Never struggle, never choose. He calls it peace. We call it death of the spirit, which is worse than death of the body." Rimuru turned to face them both, and the amber eyes held something raw and unguarded. "Then what is the point of power if it cannot be used to prevent suffering?" "Power used to prevent all suffering becomes the greatest suffering," Galadriel replied. "For it removes the very thing that makes suffering bearable, the knowledge that we faced it by our own choice and emerged still ourselves." The figure stood silent for a long moment, and in that silence, the three of them might have been the only beings in Middle-earth. Finally, Rimuru spoke, and the voice had lost its earlier steadiness. "In my world I built something. A place where different peoples could live without fear. Where the strong protected the weak, not because it benefited them, but because it was right. Where choice mattered because there was genuine safety in which to make choices." The words came faster now, driven by something that might have been grief. "But I built it slowly, carefully, with the consent of those who would live there. I never took a choice away, even when taking it would have saved lives, even when it would have been easier. And now, you're in a world not your own," Gandalf said quietly. where the choices belong to others and your power, however great, is not your right to wield. If the free peoples gain but a different master, then my coming is hollow mercy, Rimuru said, and in those words Galadriel heard an echo of something she herself had once wrestled with long ago, in a land now drowned beneath the sea. I understand. I will not take what is not mine to take. Not the war, not the victory, not even the suffering, if suffering is the price of remaining free to choose. Galadriel studied the figure before her with eyes that had witnessed the rise and fall of ages. What she saw satisfied something in her, though whether it was hope or simply the recognition of shared burden, none but she could say. Then you may remain at this council, she said at last. Not as savior, not as conqueror, but as witness and perhaps ally if the hour grows dark enough that even witnesses must stand or fall with those they have chosen to stand beside. They returned to the Hall of Fire, where the council waited with the patience of those who understand that some conversations cannot be rushed. Elrond read the answer in Galadriel's expression before she spoke, and something in his ancient features eased. The stranger has been tested, Galadriel announced to the assembly, and found neither enemy nor fool. We will speak of the enemy's power, and this one will hear, and perhaps in the hearing wisdom will find us all. Rimuru returned to the stone bench, and this time when the figure sat, it was not apart from the others, but among them. Still separate in nature, but joined in purpose, or at least in the willingness to understand what purpose might require. Gandalf resumed his place by the fire, and as the council turned at last to the matter of the ring and the darkness growing in the east, the wizard allowed himself the smallest of smiles. The note that had fallen into the world's song had found a chord that might yet harmonize with the music already playing. Whether that harmony would be enough to stand against the discord that Morgoth had seeded and Sauron now cultivated, none could say. But for the first time since the stranger's arrival, those gathered in Rivendell felt something that had been absent, a cautious, fragile hope, that not all surprises need be catastrophes. The council spoke long into the night, and the words exchanged there would shape the fate of the age. But underneath it all ran a current that had not been present before, the understanding that even in a world whose story seemed already written there, remained space for new verses if those verses were sung with care and humility. Rimuru listened, and in listening learned what Middle-earth valued above all else. Not the power to change fate, but the courage to face it freely, whatever the cost. And in the shadows beyond Rivendell's borders, the servants of Mordor felt an unease. They could not name a sense that something in the balance had shifted, though toward what end even the Dark Lord himself could not yet discern. The vale that Rimuru chose lay 3 days east of Rivendell, far enough from the hidden refuge that its presence would not draw unwanted eyes close enough that word could travel swiftly should need arise. It was an unremarkable place by the standards of Middle-earth. A shallow depression between two hills, sheltered from the worst winds, with a stream running clear over stones that had known no touch but water and time. Gandalf had accompanied the journey, along with an elf named Lindir, whose eyes missed little and whose silence spoke more than most men's speeches. They stood now at the vale's edge, watching as Rimuru surveyed the empty land with an attention that suggested seeing more than grass and stone. "This will serve," Rimuru said finally, and there was something in the tone that made Gandalf's hand tighten on his staff. "Serve for what precisely?" the wizard asked. "Elrond granted you leave to remain in these lands, not to reshape them." Rimuru turned, and the amber eyes held neither defiance nor apology. "I don't intend to reshape anything. But if I'm to be here to witness, as Galadriel said, then I should be where those who need witnessing might find me. A place for those caught between the armies, for those who don't wish to fight but need somewhere to wait out the storm." Lindir spoke for the first time since they'd left Rivendell. "Lothlorien serves such purpose, as does Rivendell itself. Why create another refuge when refuges already exist?" Because not everyone can reach Lothlorien, Rimuru replied. Not everyone knows the hidden paths to Rivendell. And some who need shelter most are those your people have the least reason to trust. The figure gestured toward the veil. This will be for them, the forgotten ones, the ones who fall between the cracks of great events. Gandalf studied Rimuru with the intensity of one reading a text in a language half remembered. You speak as if you have done this before. Built places for the displaced. I have. The words came soft, almost reluctant. In another world, in another time. It was what I knew how to do. Build. Protect. Not through walls or weapons, but through the simple fact of offering safety without demanding anything in return. Nothing is without cost. Linder set his voice, carrying the weight of one who had seen too many generous offers curdle into obligation. Even charity binds the receiver to the giver. Rimuru met the elf's gaze without wavering. Then I'll have to make sure the only thing binding anyone here is their own choice to stay or leave. The wizard and the elf exchanged glances, an entire conversation passing in the space of that shared look. Finally, Gandalf nodded, though the gesture carried reservations like stones in a stream. Do what you will, he said. But remember Tom Bombadil's words. Sing soft, step light. This world has a way of noticing those who press too hard upon it, and its notice is not always kind. With that, the wizard departed Lindir, following with the fluid grace of one who had walked these lands since before the moon first rose. Rimuru watched them go until they disappeared beyond the western hill, then turned to face the empty vale. The work began not with grand gestures, but with small ones. First came water. The stream already provided, but Rimuru guided its flow, not forcing, not commanding, but simply suggesting a better path around a cluster of stones. The water obliged, finding the new route and settling into it as if it had always run that way. Then shelter. Not buildings for buildings would draw attention and require maintenance and speak of permanence this place could not claim. Instead, Rimuru coaxed the earth into forming shallow berms, shaped the slope of the hills to offer windbreaks, encouraged a stand of young ash trees to grow closer together than they might have naturally, creating a canopy that would shield without imprisoning. It took 3 days, and when it was done, anyone passing through the vale would see nothing unusual. Just a pleasant spot where travelers might rest, where the stream ran convenient and the shelter felt welcoming without announcing itself. No walls, no gates, no markers that declared this place claimed or protected. Yet those who entered felt it immediately, a sense of safety that had no obvious source. A weight lifted from shoulders that had carried it so long they'd forgotten what lightness felt like. The first to find the haven was a woman. She came from the south, ragged and hollow-eyed, with 2 children clinging to her skirts and terror in every line of her body. Rimuru found her at the vale's edge, near sunset, frozen in the paralysis of one who no longer trusts that rest might not be a trap. There's water, Rimuru said, keeping distance enough that flight remained possible. And shelter. No cost, no questions. The woman stared, her hand moving to a knife that had more rust than edge. Nothing's free. This is... Why? Rimuru considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Because some things should be. And because I can offer it without losing anything that matters. The woman's eyes narrowed, searching for the lie, the angle, the hidden price. She found nothing which seemed to trouble her more than any demand would have. But the children were hungry, and night was coming, and sometimes survival required trusting against all wisdom. She entered the vale. By the next morning, 3 more had arrived. A dwarf who'd lost his caravan to raiders and spoke to no one. An old man from Rohan who'd walked east, seeking a son who would never be found. A half-elven child neither accepted by humans nor welcomed among the firstborn, with eyes that had seen too much and understood too little. Rimuru moved among this like a shadow at noon, present, but unobtrusive, offering firewood and food that seemed to appear without obvious source, speaking only when spoken to, and then with a brevity that suggested words were a courtesy rather than a currency. The woman, whose name was Mara, watched this with suspicion that slowly, grudgingly, began to crack. "What are you?" she asked on the third night as her children slept and the fire burned low. Rimuru sat across the flames, face half hidden in shadow. Someone who knows what it's like to be lost, and what it's like to find shelter when shelter should have been impossible. "You're not from here, from Middle-earth." "No." "So why stay? Why build this?" She gestured at the veil, at the small gathering of displaced souls finding rest in its bounds. "What do you gain?" The question hung in the air between them, and Rimuru took time answering, as if weighing words on scales that measured more than meaning. "I gain the knowledge that I'm still capable of doing something that matters. That power, if I have it, can be used for something other than solving problems with force." The amber eyes reflected firelight, turning them briefly gold. "In my world, I built a nation. Here I build a campfire. But the principle is the same. Give people a chance to choose their own path, and they'll surprise you with their strength." Mara snorted, but the sound lacked true derision. "Pretty sentiment. But the world isn't built on choices. It's built on who has the power to take what they want and who's too weak to stop them." "Then maybe the world is built wrong," Rimuru said quietly. "And maybe the only way to rebuild it is to show that another way is possible, even if that way is small and temporary and helps only a handful instead of the multitudes." The woman had no answer to that, so she turned to banking the fire, and the conversation ended in the comfortable silence of two people who had said what needed saying. Days passed. The haven grew not in size, but in purpose. Word spread through channels known only to the desperate and the displaced, whispered rumors of a place where those fleeing war might rest without judgment, where the only law was leave when you wish and take only what you need. 12 souls, then 20. Never more than that, for Rimuru had learned long ago that safety scaled poorly. Too many people in one place drew attention, created hierarchy, turned refuge into settlement, and settlement into target. When the 21st arrived, Rimuru gently suggested that perhaps another haven might be needed elsewhere, and helped provision those who were ready to move on. Some went north, some west, carrying with them not just supplies, but the memory that kindness existed even in a world darkening toward war. Gandalf returned on the 16th day. He came alone, arriving at dawn when mist still clung to the stream, and those sheltering in the vale were just beginning to wake. The wizard walked through the encampment, for it was a camp now, however temporary, with eyes that catalogued everything and judgment that remained carefully hidden. Rimuru met him at the vale's eastern edge, where the land rose toward the distant shadow of mountains. "You've been busy," Gandalf observed. "I've been useful." "Not the same thing." Rimuru acknowledged the point with a slight inclination of the head. "No, but in this case I hope they overlap." Gandalf was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted, carrying a weight that went beyond the immediate conversation. "What you're building here troubles me," he said. "Not because it's wrong, but because it's fragile. These people look at you with hope, and hope is a dangerous thing to inspire when you cannot guarantee you'll be here to sustain it." "I'm not trying to sustain it," Rimuru replied. "I'm trying to kindle it. There's a difference. What they do with that hope once I'm gone is their choice, not my responsibility." "Is it?" The wizard's eyes were sharp now, piercing. "You speak of choice and freedom, but you've created a dependency nonetheless. They may choose to stay or go, but the choice exists only because you maintain this place. Remove yourself and what remains." The question struck deeper than perhaps Gandalf intended, for Rimuru went very still, and something flickered across the figure's features that might have been pain or recognition, or both. "You're right," Rimuru said finally. "This can't last. It was never meant to, I know that." "Do you—" Gandalf leaned forward, his voice dropping to something almost gentle. Or do you hope that by making yourself indispensable, you'll find a reason to stay that doesn't require you to face the larger question? Which question? Whether you're here to help Middle-earth or to escape whatever you left behind. Silence fell between them, broken only by the distant sound of children's laughter from the camp. It was a sound that belonged to a world at peace, incongruous against the knowledge that armies were gathering and darkness spreading and time running short for all who valued light. Rimuru finally spoke, and the words came with visible effort. I don't know. I thought I did, but standing here listening to people thank me for doing something that costs me nothing while they've lost everything. I don't know what I'm doing. Only that doing nothing felt worse than doing this. Gandalf's expression softened, and he placed a hand on Rimuru's shoulder the first time the wizard had initiated such contact. The touch was brief but deliberate. That at least is honest, he said. Remember it when the harder choices come. Remember that uncertainty is not weakness, and that the greatest dangers come not from those who doubt, but from those who are certain they're right. A shout from the camp interrupted them. Not alarm, but surprise. They turned to see a group approaching from the north, not refugees this time, but rangers. Tall, weathered men who moved with the confidence of those who knew every stone and stream in these lands. Their leader, a grim-faced man with gray in his beard, stopped at the camp's edge and surveyed the scene with eyes that missed nothing. After a long moment, he approached Rimuru and Gandalf, his hand resting on his sword hilt, not in threat, but in ready caution. You're the one they're talking about, he said to Rimuru, voice rough as gravel. The stranger building refuges. I am. The ranger glanced at Gandalf, some question passing between them that needed no words. Then back to Rimuru. We've been watching. Wanted to see if this was a trap or genuine charity. He paused. Seems genuine, but there's something you should know. What's that? You're being watched by others too. Not rangers, not friends. 3 days ago, one of the enemy scouts was ranging this area. We drove it off, but it saw enough. Mordor knows you're here, knows you're gathering people. The ranger's eyes were hard. Kindness draws attention in dark times. Not all of it welcome. Rimuru absorbed this with a calm that suggested the news was expected, if not desired. Thank you for the warning. Warning's free. Next time protection might not be. The ranger gestured to the camp. These people have a choice now. Stay and risk becoming a target or scatter before the enemy decides this place is worth crushing. I understand. Do you? The ranger's voice carried an edge now. Because from where I stand, you've painted a target on folk who just wanted to hide. Whatever you are, whatever you can do, you've made their lives more dangerous, not less. Is that the help you intended? The question landed like a physical blow. Rimuru had no immediate answer, and in that hesitation, the truth of the ranger's words settled with uncomfortable weight. Gandalf intervened before the silence could stretch too far. Your warning is noted and appreciated. We'll discuss what must be done. The ranger nodded, but his eyes remained on Rimuru. I hope you know what you're doing, stranger. Because if you don't, people will die for your good intentions. With that, he and his men departed, fading into the landscape with the ease of long practice. Rimuru stood very still, watching them go. When the figure finally spoke, the voice was barely audible. He's right, I've made things worse. Perhaps, Gandalf said. Or perhaps you've given them a choice they wouldn't have had otherwise, to face danger together rather than alone. The outcome is not yet written, but it's my responsibility. Yes, the wizard agreed, offering no false comfort. It is. Welcome to the burden of power used with good intent. The outcome is rarely clean, and the price is almost always paid by those you sought to help. Rimuru turned to face the camp where people moved about their morning tasks with a lightness that had been absent when they arrived. Children played. The old man from Rohan was showing the dwarf how to weave grass into rope. Mara was teaching someone else how to stretch meager rations into something approaching a meal. Small moments, fragile peace, and underneath it all, the growing certainty that this could not last. "I need to prepare them," Rimuru said. "Give them the choice the ranger mentioned, stay or scatter. And if they choose to stay, then I stay with them. And when the enemy's servants come, they'll find I'm not as easy to crush as they expect." Gandalf heard in that statement the edge of something that had been carefully restrained until now. Be careful. The line between protection and domination is thinner than you think. I know. Rimuru's hands clenched, then relaxed. But I also know that standing aside while people suffer, because I'm afraid of crossing that line, is just another form of cowardice. I'll walk the edge as carefully as I can. It's all anyone can do. The wizard nodded, accepting this. They stood together in silence, watching the dawn light strengthen across the vale, illuminating both the beauty of what had been built and the shadow of what was coming. In the camp, people moved and lived and found brief respite from a world at war. How long that respite would last, none could say. But for now, in this moment, it existed. And Rimuru learned another lesson Middle-earth had to teach, that even temporary kindness has consequences, and that the burden of choice falls heaviest on those who give others the freedom to choose. The haven remained. But its days were numbered, and everyone there knew it, whether they spoke the knowledge aloud or kept it locked in the spaces between words. Soon, very soon, the choice would come. And in that choosing, the true measure of what Rimuru had built would be tested not in peace, but in the crucible that burned all things, the approach of war, and the shadow that preceded it. The attack came on the 19th night, when the moon hid behind clouds, and the stars seemed to withdraw their light, as if unwilling to witness what was about to unfold. Mara woke first. Not to sound for the Nazgul, moved in silence deeper than mere absence of noise. She woke to cold, a cold that had nothing to do with autumn air, and everything to do with the sudden certainty that something had gone irreversibly wrong with the world. Her breath misted before her face despite the banked fire. Frost crept across the ground where none had been moments before. She reached for her children, pulling them close, and saw others stirring throughout the camp. The dwarf had his hand on an axe he'd claimed from somewhere, though his fingers trembled too badly to grip it properly. The half-elven child stood frozen, eyes wide and unseeing, caught in some terror that went beyond the physical. Then the screaming began, not from any throat. The sound came from the air itself, from the spaces between breaths, a wail that bypassed ears entirely and drove straight into the marrow of bones. It spoke of endings and despair, and the fundamental wrongness of hope in a world that would grind all brightness into ash. 3 shapes descended into the vale. They wore the semblance of riders, though no horse of Middle-earth's breeding could have borne them. The mounts were things of shadow and malice, twisted from what might once have been noble beasts into mockeries that existed only to carry servants of the enemy. But it was the riders themselves that froze the blood tall robed in black, that seemed to drink light crowned with iron, that held no gleam. The Nazgul had found Rimuru's haven. Rimuru appeared at the camp's center, and those who could still think through their terror saw that the figure's usual calm had fractured. Not into fear, never quite that, but into something harder, colder, a readiness that suggested decisions had been made in the space between one heartbeat and the next. "Stay down," Rimuru said, voice cutting through the wail with surprising clarity. "Don't run. Don't look at them. Just stay down and breathe." One of the Nazgul spoke, if speech was the right word for the sound that emerged from beneath its hood. The language was black speech, but the intent needed no translation. It demanded surrender. It demanded submission. It demanded that all within the veil kneel before the will of Mordor or be unmade. Rimuru stepped forward, placing body between the wraiths and the huddled refugees. "You have no authority here." Rimuru said, and though the words were quiet, they carried across the veil with a weight that pushed back against the despair. These people have made no war against your master. They seek only to survive. That's not a crime worth hunting. The response was laughter, if the sound of tombs opening could be called laughter. The lead Nazgul raised one gauntleted hand, and the temperature plummeted further. Frost became ice. Breath became painful. And the black breath, the spiritual poison that was the wraith's most terrible weapon, began to seep across the ground like fog made of concentrated hopelessness. It touched the nearest refugee, the old man from Rohan, and he collapsed, not dead but emptied, his eyes staring at nothing, while his spirit fled to places even the body could not follow. Rimuru's hands clenched. For a span of 3 heartbeats, nothing moved. The world seemed to hang suspended, waiting to see which way the stranger would break toward mercy, or toward power, toward restraint, or toward the terrible simplicity of overwhelming force. Then Rimuru sang, not with voice, not with words, but with something that bypassed sound entirely and touched the fabric beneath the world's skin. It was not the music of the Ainur, could never be. That for Rimuru was not of Arda and knew nothing of those primordial harmonies. But it was music, nonetheless, a rhythm that belonged to a different creation entirely, and where it touched Middle-earth, the world, hesitated. The black breath stopped spreading, not dispersed, not destroyed, simply contained, as if Rimuru had drawn an invisible boundary and convinced the very air that crossing it would mean ceasing to be air at all. The Nazgul shrieked. The sound was fury and confusion, and something that might have been the first stirrings of genuine alarm. They were creatures of the unseen world beings, whose power operated on the level of spirit and will rather than flesh and bone. And yet, here was something that could touch that realm without being claimed by it, that could stand in the space between seen and unseen without choosing either side. Rimuru's form began to blur at the edges, becoming less solid and more conceptual, as if reality itself was uncertain what category to place this being in. The refugees who were still conscious enough to watch saw the stranger's outline shimmer like heat haze, saw the amber eyes begin to glow with a light that had no source in fire or star. "I said you have no authority here," Rimuru repeated, and this time the words carried harmonics that made the stones in the streambed resonate. "These people are under my protection, and I am very, very tired of things that think power gives them the right to terrorize the helpless." The second Nazgul urged its mount forward, drawing a blade that had been forged in darkness and quenched in sorrow. It swung the weapon in an arc meant to sever not flesh, but spirit, to cut the thread that bound will to body and leave only empty meat behind. The blade passed through empty air. Rimuru had moved, not quickly, not dramatically, but with an economy of motion that suggested the distance between points was negotiable. The figure stood now behind the wraith, one hand outstretched, and where that hand pointed something unprecedented occurred. Silence fell, not natural silence, not the quiet of a still night or a held breath. This was silence as an active force, a presence that filled the space where sound should be, and announced firmly that no noise would be permitted within its borders. The Nazgul's shriek died before it could form. The clatter of hooves went unheard. Even the wind forgot how to whistle through grass. Within that bubble of absolute quiet, the wraith flailed like a fish pulled from water. Its power depended on the spreading of despair, the infection of hope, with doubt, the corruption of will through fear. But fear required the anticipation of what was coming. And in perfect silence, with no feedback from the world, even terror lost its grip. Rimuru had not destroyed the Nazgul, had not banished it or unmade it, had simply created a small pocket of reality where the rules it relied upon no longer applied. The third wraith pulled back, and the refugees watching from their cowering positions saw something they would speak of in whispers for the rest of their lives. A ring wraith, a servant of the Dark Lord himself, showing what might almost be called hesitation. But hesitation was not retreat. And 3 against 1 were odds that even uncertainty could not overcome for long. The wraiths regrouped, and this time when they moved together, their combined wills pressing down on the haven like a mountain falling in slow motion. Rimuru met that pressure, and the world between them bent, not broke. Bent, like a bowstring drawn to its limit, but not passed like a tree in a storm that bows but does not snap. The refugees felt it as a weight lifting from their chests, as if someone had removed stones they hadn't known they were carrying. The frost stopped spreading. The cold remained, but it lost its edge of malice and became merely winter arriving early. Yet Rimuru was changing. The figure's form, which had been solid and human-seeming, now flickered between states. Sometimes present, sometimes translucent, sometimes appearing to exist in multiple places at once, as if reality couldn't quite decide where this being belonged. And from somewhere deep within that flickering form, a voice spoke that was not Rimuru's voice. Or rather, it was Rimuru's voice, but stripped of inflection, rendered into pure observation without judgment or emotion. It said only 3 words, they are echoes. Rimuru staggered, and for the first time since the attack began, genuine strain showed on the stranger's face. The figure turned toward where Mara crouched with her children, and in the amber eyes there was a terrible understanding. "The Nazgul aren't independent," Rimuru said, voice rough. "They're extensions, fingers of the same hand. And the hand is the ring." The word went unspoken, but everyone who heard understood. The wraiths were not separate threats that could be defeated one by one. They were manifestations of a single will, fragments of a consciousness that dwelt in a golden band currently being carried toward Mordor by a hobbit who had no idea what forces were arraying against him. To truly stop the Nazgul meant confronting the ring itself. And that was a line Rimuru had sworn not to cross. The silence bubble collapsed. Sound rushed back into the world, like water into a broken dam. And with it came the full force of the wraith's assault. They sensed the hesitation, the moment of doubt, and pressed their advantage with the relentless efficiency of things that did not tire, did not question, did not feel anything except the imperative to serve. Rimuru fell to one knee, and the refugees who had been watching with desperate hope felt that hope curdle into ash. Then Gandalf arrived. The wizard came from the west, his staff blazing with a white light that had nothing to do with fire and everything to do with the authority granted to Istari by the Valar themselves. He spoke no word, made no grand gesture, simply stood at the veil's edge, and that being was enough to make the Nazgul pause. "Enough," Gandalf said, and in his voice carried the weight of millennia. "You have found what you sought. You have witnessed what dwells here. Carry that knowledge back to your master, and tell him this: the stranger is not his to claim, not his to corrupt, and not his to destroy. Other powers watch this one. Older powers. Powers that remember when Sauron was but a servant playing its shadows. It was bluff. Masterful bluff, but bluff nonetheless. The Valar had not intervened in Middle-earth's affairs for ages uncounted. And there was no reason to think they would begin now for the sake of a being that did not even belong to their creation. But the Nazgul, for all their malice and power, were still bound by the hierarchies of their master's court. They knew of powers greater than themselves. They knew that the Dark Lord, for all his strength, was not the only force that shaped Arda's fate. And they knew, as all servants of Mordor knew, that certainty was preferable to risk when the stakes involved the master's displeasure. The lead Nazgul spoke one final time, and though the words were black speech, the meaning was clear. This is not over. Then they were gone, dissolving into shadow and malice, and the particular cold that lingers in places where hope has been tested and found fragile. Rimuru collapsed fully, catching weight on both hands, breathing hard. Gandalf crossed to the stranger's side with surprising speed for one who appeared so old. "Can you stand?" the wizard asked quietly. "Yes." Rimuru's voice was steady despite the trembling in the figure's limbs. "But I can't stay. None of us can. They know where this place is now. They'll come back with more or worse, or they'll simply tell Sauron and he'll send something I can't bluff into retreating." "It was not a bluff," Gandalf said, and there was something in his tone that suggested layers the refugees would never understand. "But you're right. This haven is compromised. The people must scatter." Mara found her voice, though it came out broken. Where do we go that's safer than this?" Rimuru looked at her, and in that gaze she saw both apology and iron determination. "Rivendell. Lothlorien. The settlements in the west where the enemy's reach is shorter. Gandalf will guide some of you. The Rangers will take others. But you cannot stay together. A group this size is a target. Alone or in pairs, you become invisible again. You're sending us away." The half-elven child's voice was small lost. "I'm giving you the chance to survive," Rimuru corrected gently. "That's all I ever had to offer. The illusion of safety was my mistake. I'm sorry. The apology hung in the cold air, genuine and painful. Gandalf raised his staff, and a signal fire blazed at its tip, a call to the Rangers who watched these lands, a summons that would bring help before dawn. Then he turned back to Rimuru, with eyes that had witnessed the rise and fall of kingdoms. "What you did tonight," the wizard said quietly, so only Rimuru could hear. "That silence. That was not magic as Middle-earth understands it." "No," Rimuru agreed. "It was something else. Something from my world translated into terms this world could tolerate. Barely. And the voice that spoke through you," Rimuru's jaw tightened. "A part of me that's supposed to help. Supposed to analyze and advise. But here in this world, it's degrading, fragmenting. Tonight it could only give me 3 words before it went silent again. 3 words that saved lives," Gandalf pointed out. "But also 3 words that told you something you did not wish to hear. That I can't fight them without fighting the ring itself. That every confrontation with the Nazgul is really a confrontation with the thing they serve. And that thing..." Rimuru broke off, shaking. "I felt it, Gandalf. For just a moment when the voice spoke, I felt what the ring is. Not just a tool of power, a hunger. A vast, patient hunger that wants everything to belong to it." The wizard nodded slowly. "Now you understand what we face. And why it must be destroyed, not wielded, not even by those with the best intentions." By dawn, the haven was empty. The refugees had scattered according to Gandalf's guidance, some north, with rangers, some west, toward distant settlements, a few brave souls south, toward Rohan's borders. Mara and her children went with an elf messenger, bound for Rivendell, looking back once at Rimuru with an expression that held both gratitude and accusation. The dwarf simply nodded and walked away, carrying his axe and his silence into the wilderness. The old man from Rohan recovered from the Black Breath's touch, but diminished by it, accepted a ranger's arm and disappeared into the morning mist. Rimuru stood alone in the vale, watching the sun rise over what had been, for a brief span, something like home. The stream still ran clear. The trees still offered shelter. But the sense of safety was gone, burned away by the cold reality of wraiths and hunger, and the knowledge that kindness could be weaponized by those who sought targets. Gandalf remained at the vale's edge, giving the stranger space to process what had been lost. Finally, Rimuru spoke. "I thought I could help without getting involved. Build something small and temporary that wouldn't matter in the larger story. I was wrong. Perhaps Kandom..." Gandalf allowed. "Or perhaps you helped more than you know. Those people will carry the memory that someone tried, even knowing the cost. In dark times, that memory has value beyond measure." "Is that supposed to comfort me?" "No, it's supposed to prepare you for the harder choices ahead." The wizard's eyes were kind, but unyielding. You've learned that you cannot stand apart from this world's fate. The question now is whether you'll stand with us in facing it, or whether you'll seek another hollow mercy to pursue. Rimuru turned to face Gandalf fully, and something in the stranger's expression had changed since the night before. Something had hardened, crystallized from the soft intention of charity into the sharp necessity of decision. "I'll stand with you," Rimuru said, "but on my terms. I won't become what that ring wants me to become. I won't solve your war with overwhelming force. But I also won't hide while people suffer for my cowardice." "Then you've chosen the narrow path," Gandalf said. "The one that offers neither the comfort of detachment nor the false certainty of domination. Welcome to the company of all who fight the shadow, those who must walk the edge between too much action and too little, and pray they judge rightly when the moment comes." They left the vale together as the sun climbed higher, leaving behind only the altered stream and the memory of what had been attempted and what had been learned at terrible cost. The haven was gone, but its purpose had been served in ways neither Rimuru nor Gandalf fully understood. Word would spread not through formal channels, but through the whispered networks of the desperate and displaced that someone had tried to offer shelter without demanding allegiance. That someone had stood against the Nazgul and lived. That even in a world darkening toward war, there remained those who would risk everything for strangers who could offer nothing in return. Seeds had been planted. Whether they would take root or wither, none could say. But in the calculus of hope against despair, even failed kindness counted for something. The Nazgul returned to Mordor, bearing news their master found both troubling and intriguing. A new player had entered the game, one who could touch the unseen without being claimed by it. One whose power operated on principles the Dark Lord's vast experience could not immediately categorize. In the depths of Barad-dûr, a consciousness that dwelt in a golden ring stirred with interest. And in the west, a stranger walked beside a wizard, learning with each step that Middle-earth would teach its lessons, whether the student was ready or not. And that the price of those lessons was always paid in the coin of consequences unforeseen. The fellowship was formed in secrecy and necessity, 9 walkers against the shadow, and Rimuru was not among them. This was by design. Elrond had made clear in the days following the scattering of the Haven that the quest to destroy the ring could not afford complications. Every member must be chosen for their resistance to its call, their commitment to the cause, and their place within Middle-earth's intricate web of allegiances and histories. Rimuru being outside that web entirely represented a variable the quest could not accommodate. But Gandalf had asked one thing, that Rimuru meet the ring-bearer before the fellowship departed, if only to understand fully what was being carried into darkness and what price would be demanded of those who carried it. So it was that on a gray morning with frost still clinging to the grass of Rivendell's gardens, Rimuru stood waiting beside the path that led to Bilbo Baggins' quarters, where the ring currently rested in a pocket that seemed too small to contain such weight. Frodo Baggins came walking up the path alone, though Gandalf watched from a distance, ready to intervene should intervention become necessary. The hobbit was smaller than Rimuru had expected, though the stranger had learned by now that size in Middle-earth bore little relation to significance. What struck more deeply was the weariness in Frodo's eyes, not physical exhaustion, though there was that too, but a spiritual fatigue that spoke of carrying burdens no soul should have to bear. "Gandalf said you wished to speak with me." Frodo said, his voice carrying the careful courtesy of one who has learned that strangers are not always friends, but need not always be enemies. "If you're willing," Rimuru replied. "I wanted to understand what you carry. Not the ring itself, I have no desire to see it or touch it. But you, the one who chooses to carry it despite knowing what it costs." Frodo's hand moved unconsciously to his chest, where beneath layers of cloth and leather, the ring hung on its chain. The gesture was protective, possessive, and utterly unconscious. He noticed Rimuru watching and forced his hand back to his side. "It's heavy," Frodo said simply. "Not in weight. In presence. Like carrying a voice that never stops whispering, never stops suggesting that there are easier ways, better ways, if only I would listen." "What does it whisper?" The hobbit's eyes grew distant, looking at something only he could see. "Different things to different people, I think. To me it whispers of safety, of home, of making the Shire a place where nothing bad could ever happen again, where my friends would never be threatened, where I could protect everything I love." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely audible. "It makes that sound like wisdom instead of tyranny." Rimuru was silent for a long moment. Then, "May I walk with you? I promise I won't ask to see it. I just want to understand." Frodo studied the stranger with eyes that seemed far too old for his face, weighing risks that had become second nature. Finally, he nodded. They walked through Rivendell's gardens, where autumn had turned the leaves to gold and copper. But the elven magic woven into root and branch kept spring's memory alive beneath the surface. Gandalf followed at a distance, his presence both comfort and warning. "The ring isn't evil," Frodo said as they walked, the words coming as if they'd been held back too long and needed release. "That's what people don't understand. It's not some creature of darkness that hates the world. It's more insidious than that. It wants to help. It wants to make things better. It just defines better as everything being under its control." "So it's not a tool," Rimuru said slowly, understanding dawning. "It's a philosophy made manifest." "Yes." Frodo's relief at being understood was palpable. "A philosophy that sounds reasonable until you realize it leaves no room for anyone to choose differently. Until you realize that its version of peace is everyone wanting the same thing, because no one is allowed to want anything else." They reached a stone bench overlooking a small waterfall, its music a counterpoint to the heavy conversation. Frodo sat with the careful positioning of one who had learned to distribute weight that existed more in spirit than substance. Rimuru remained standing, amber eyes fixed on something in the middle distance. "In my world, I face something similar. Not a ring, but a choice. I had the power to remake reality according to what I thought was right. To eliminate suffering by eliminating the conditions that allowed suffering to exist. To make everyone safe by making everyone the same." "What stopped you?" "The realization that I would be trading humanity for security. That a world where no one can make bad choices is a world where no one can make real choices at all." Rimuru turned to face Frodo directly. "But the temptation doesn't go away just because you recognize it. It whispers. Just like your ring whispers." Frodo nodded, understanding, passing between two souls who had wrestled with similar demons, even if the shape of those demons differed. "Gandalf says you're powerful. More powerful than most things in Middle-earth. Does your power whisper too?" "Always," Rimuru admitted. "Every moment I see suffering, I could prevent. Every time I watch someone struggle with a problem I could solve, in an instant it whispers that restraint is just another word for cowardice. But you restrain anyway." "I try to. I don't always succeed." "The Haven." Rimuru broke off, pain flickering across features that had learned to hide emotion. "I told myself I was helping. And maybe I was for a time. But I also made those people targets. I put them in danger by offering them hope. The road to tyranny isn't paved with evil intentions. It's paved with the certainty that you know better than everyone else what they need." Frodo was quiet for a time, and in that silence, the waterfall sang its endless song, indifferent to the weight of the conversation occurring in its presence. "May I ask you something?" the hobbit finally said. "Something perhaps impertinent?" "Please." "Why are you here? Not in Rivendell. I understand that. But in Middle-earth at all? Gandalf says you didn't choose to come, but you also haven't tried very hard to leave. What keeps you? It was a question Rimuru had been avoiding, even in the privacy of the stranger's own thoughts. The answer, when it came, surprised even the one speaking it. Because I'm afraid that if I leave, I'll forget what I learned here. I'll go back to my world and convince myself that the rules are different there, that I'm different there, that the warnings don't apply. And I'll become the thing I'm trying not to be. Rimuru's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Middle-earth is teaching me restraint in a way my own world never could. Because here, I'm not supposed to be the solution. I'm not even supposed to be a factor. I'm just present, witnessing. And maybe that's the most important thing I can learn, how to be present without needing to be necessary. Frodo reached out, and in a gesture that held both courage and compassion, touched Rimuru's hand briefly. The contact was fleeting, but in it the stranger felt an understanding that went beyond words. We're alike, you and I, Frodo said, carrying weights we didn't ask for, trying to do right in a world that doesn't make right easy. The difference is that I have to carry mine to a fire and throw it away. What will you do with yours? Before Rimuru could answer, the air changed. It happened without warning, without preamble. One moment they sat in autumn sunlight, discussing philosophy and burden. The next, the world tilted sideways, and Rimuru was no longer seeing with eyes, but with something deeper. Something that perceived the unseen as clearly as the seen. And in that doubled vision, the ring blazed, not with light, with hunger. With an appetite so vast and patient and absolutely certain of its eventual victory that it made the stranger's earlier encounters with the Nazgul seem like children playing at malice. The ring wanted with a purity of purpose that was almost beautiful in its terrifying simplicity. It wanted Rimuru, not to destroy, not to corrupt in the conventional sense. It wanted the stranger's power, yes, but more than that, it wanted Rimuru's certainty that things could be better, that suffering could be ended, that power wielded with good intentions would yield good results. It wanted to take that certainty and show it the most seductive lie of all, that you're strong enough to handle it, that you're different, that you won't fall like the others. The voice that had spoken during the Nazgul attack. Echo of the song, degraded and fragmenting, but still functional, tried to manifest. Tried to analyze, to provide data, to give Rimuru the information needed to resist. It managed 4 words. It knows you already. Then Echo screamed, not audibly. The sound existed only in the space behind thought, a shriek of agony as something that operated on pure logic encountered something that operated on pure desire, and discovered they were incompatible at a fundamental level. Echo had tried to analyze the ring the way it would analyze any phenomenon, breaking it down, understanding its structure, categorizing its function. But the ring was not a phenomenon. It was an anti-principle given form. It was the opposite of analysis, the negation of objective understanding. It simply was, and in that being, it rejected anything that tried to stand outside and observe it neutrally. Echo fragmented. Pieces of the analytical framework that had guided Rimuru through countless decisions scattered like glass under a hammer. Some disappeared entirely. Others remained but twisted their function, bent toward serving a purpose they had never been designed to serve. Rimuru fell to one knee, gasping. The world snapped back into single vision, but the damage was done. Echo was still there, still functioning, but now it spoke in whispers and suggestions rather than clear guidance, and some of those suggestions tasted wrong. Frodo was on his feet, one hand gripping Rimuru's shoulder, alarm clear on his face. Gandalf had materialized beside them with the speed of genuine concern, his staff already glowing with protective light. "What happened?" the wizard demanded. "The ring," Rimuru managed, voice rough. "It didn't attack. It just existed at me. And that was enough. Gandalf's expression grew grim. You looked at it with sight beyond sight. You tried to understand it as you would understand any other thing. But the ring is not a thing to be understood. It is a trap that uses understanding as its bait. I didn't look, Rimuru protested weakly. It just happened. The vision came without my choosing it. Because proximity matters, Frodo said quietly, his hand still on Rimuru's shoulder, despite the trembling in his own limbs. The closer you are, the harder it pulls. Even without seeing it directly, even without touching it, it's always there. Always pressing, always waiting for a moment of weakness. Rimuru looked up at the hobbit and saw reflected there a strength that had nothing to do with power and everything to do with simply continuing to stand, despite every reason to fall. Frodo had carried the ring for months, lived with that pressure every waking moment, and still chose every day to carry it toward its destruction rather than succumb to its seduction. "How do you bear it?" Rimuru asked. Frodo's smile was sad and knowing. "Badly. I bear it badly. But I bear it anyway because the alternative is worse." He helped Rimuru to stand, this small hobbit supporting someone who could unmake mountains. Sam helps. Gandalf helps. Knowing there are others who would share the burden if they could, that helps most of all. But in the end, it's just choosing every moment not to give in. There's no trick to it, no secret. Just the decision made over and over until hopefully there are enough decisions that I reach the fire before I run out of strength to make them. Gandalf was watching Rimuru with an intensity that suggested evaluation rather than mere concern. "What did it offer you?" he asked quietly. Rimuru was silent for a long moment, and when the answer came, it was given with visible effort. Efficiency. Optimization. The chance to fix everything that's wrong with Middle-earth in one decisive action. It showed me how I could end the war before it properly begins. How I could make sure no one else has to die, no one else has to suffer, no one else has to make the terrible choices that war demands. The stranger's voice cracked. It showed me a world where I save everyone, and all it would cost is their freedom to be saved or not. "And you wanted it," Gandalf said. Not an accusation, a statement of fact. "Yes," Rimuru whispered. "For a moment, I wanted it more than I've wanted anything since coming to this world. The certainty, the simplicity, the knowledge that I could finally stop watching people suffer and just fix it all. That," Frodo said with the weight of bitter experience, "is exactly what it showed me about the Shire. What it shows everyone about whatever they love most. The ring doesn't offer evil. It offers the thing you want most in the world wrapped in logic that sounds unassailable, and then watches you strangle yourself with your own good intentions." They sat together in silence while Rimuru recovered. The gardens of Rivendell held their beauty indifferent to the struggle playing out among the three figures by the waterfall. Birds sang. Wind rustled through leaves that held colors no mortal smith could replicate. The world continued its turning, and in that continuation, there was a kind of mercy, the reminder that individual failures, however devastating, did not stop the larger music from playing. Eventually, Gandalf spoke, his voice gentler than before. "Can you still function? Is the analytical framework fully compromised?" Rimuru tested the internal spaces where Echo had once provided clear guidance. What remained was scattered, unreliable, prone to suggestions that felt subtly off target. Not destroyed, but damaged in ways that would take time to heal, if healing was even possible, in a world whose fundamental nature was incompatible with Echo's original design. "I can function," Rimuru said slowly, "but I can't trust the voice the way I used to. It's tainted, maybe. Or just broken. I'll have to rely more on judgment than analysis. On feeling rather than calculation." "Then you are becoming more like us," Frodo observed. We who must choose without certainty, act without perfect information, and hope that our intentions are pure, even when we cannot be sure our actions are wise. Is that supposed to be encouraging? No, Frodo said with a small, sad smile. It's supposed to be honest. Gandalf helped Rimuru to stand the wizard's strength, surprising in his aged frame. You have learned an important lesson today. The ring cannot be analyzed. It cannot be understood in the way you understand other challenges. It can only be resisted or surrendered to, and resistance requires accepting that some battles cannot be won through superior knowledge. Then how are they won? Through superior commitment to losing, if that's what preserving freedom requires. The wizard's eyes held depths of sorrow that spoke to battles fought across ages. The ring offers victory. We offer only the chance to choose defeat on our own terms rather than have victory forced upon us on its terms. It's not a bargain most would accept if given real choice. But you accept it anyway because we understand something the ring does not, will never comprehend. Gandalf gestured broadly at Rivendell, at Middle-earth, beyond, at the whole vast tapestry of peoples and places and stories interweaving toward uncertain fate. That meaning exists not in victory, but in the struggle. That a loss freely chosen carries more truth than a triumph compelled. That in the end, what we are matters more than what we accomplish. Rimuru absorbed this, processing it through mental frameworks, now unreliable, and emotional understanding, still developing. The stranger turned to Frodo, seeing the hobbit with new eyes, not as someone to be protected or pitied, but as someone walking a path parallel to the one Rimuru was learning to walk. When you reach the fire, Rimuru said quietly, and you stand at the edge with that thing in your hand, and it's whispering everything you've ever wanted to hear, what will make you let go? Frodo's expression grew distant, looking at a future he could imagine, but not guarantee. I don't know. Maybe nothing will. Maybe I'll fail at the last moment after everything, and someone else will have to finish what I couldn't. He met Rimuru's gaze with an honesty that was almost painful. But I have to try anyway. Because the alternative is deciding the burden is too heavy before I've even attempted to carry it to the end. And I've learned that I'm stronger than I believed possible in ways I never wanted to discover. They parted soon after Frodo returning to his quarters to rest before the Fellowship's departure. Gandalf remaining with Rimuru to ensure the stranger's recovery was genuine. As the hobbit walked away, his small figure disappearing among Rivendell's graceful architecture, Gandalf spoke quietly. You wanted to understand the ring-bearer. Do you now? I understand that he's braver than anyone I've ever met, Rimuru replied. And that bravery sometimes looks like a small person taking one more step when every instinct screams to stop. Good. The wizard's approval was evident. Hold to that understanding. You will need it in the days ahead. Gandalf does, Rimuru said, voice hesitant. The ring knew me. Echo said it before fragmenting. It knew me already before I even looked at it. How is that possible? The wizard was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. Because the ring is Sauron's will, made manifest, and Sauron's awareness, while fragmented, is vast. When the Nazgul fled your haven, they carried information back to their master. And Sauron, in turn, studied what he learned and fed that knowledge into the ring. Gandalf turned to face Rimuru fully. It was waiting for you, prepared for you, ready to offer exactly the temptation most likely to ensnare one of your particular nature. Then it will always be ready. Every time I come near it, every time I try to help the quest in any way, it will use that against me. Yes, the blunt confirmation landed with crushing weight. Rimuru could not be near the ring, could not touch it, see it, or even exist in close proximity to it without risking corruption. The very help the stranger might offer would become a weapon the enemy could use. Then I'm useless to the quest, Rimuru said quietly. On the contrary, Gandalf replied. You are now exactly where you should be, unable to solve the problem, with your power forced to trust that others can accomplish what you cannot. This is not uselessness. This is humility. And humility is the only armor that works against the ring's particular assault. Rimuru stood in Rivendell's gardens, diminished by the encounter, but not destroyed, damaged, but still functional, and understood with painful clarity what Middle-earth had been trying to teach since the moment of arrival. Power meant nothing if its use corrupted the purpose for which it was wielded. Strength meant nothing if it robbed others of the chance to discover their own. And the greatest victory was not defeating the enemy, but refusing to become the enemy in the name of expedience. The ring had offered optimization. Rimuru had for one terrible moment wanted to accept. The stranger had said no. It was a small victory, perhaps, insignificant in the grand scope of the war to come. But it was a victory nonetheless, and it was entirely, completely Rimuru's own. The fellowship would depart without the stranger's participation. They would face darkness and danger with no guarantee of success. They would struggle where Rimuru's power could have made things easier, and that was exactly as it should be. For the first time since arriving in Middle-earth, Rimuru felt the weight of being in the right place at the right time, for the right reasons, even if that place was on the sidelines, even if that time was spent watching rather than acting, even if those reasons included accepting powerlessness as the price of preserving what mattered. Gandalf placed a hand on the stranger's shoulder, a gesture of solidarity between two beings who had learned that wisdom often meant knowing when not to act. Together they walked back toward Rivendell's halls, leaving the gardens to their eternal autumn and the waterfall to its endless song. Behind them, in a small pocket that seemed too small to contain such weight, a golden ring rested against a hobbit's chest and whispered promises it would keep repeating until the moment it was destroyed, or until it claimed every soul in Middle-earth. The war had begun, and Rimuru had just learned the most important lesson of all: that sometimes the greatest contribution is knowing what battles you must not fight, no matter how much your power insists you could win them. The fellowship departed Rivendell on a morning wrapped in mist. 9 figures disappearing into the gray, like words erased from a page still being written. Rimuru watched from the high terrace where Elrond stood with those who would remain behind, and felt the absence settle like a weight in the chest. Gandalf had not looked back. The wizard's gray robes blended with the fog until there was no telling where the man ended and the world began. And then there was only emptiness, where purpose had been. You wished to go with them, Elrond observed. It was not a question. I wished to be useful, Rimuru corrected. But usefulness and presence are not always the same thing. The Lord of Rivendell studied the stranger with eyes that had witnessed the breaking of worlds and the slow healing that came after. Gandalf will not return from this journey the same as he left. Few who carry such burdens do. But he knows this, accepts this, and goes anyway. That is the nature of sacrifice, understanding the cost and paying it regardless. Rimuru said nothing, watching the mist swallow the last traces of the fellowship's passage. Days passed. Rivendell settled into the rhythm of waiting that all refugees know during wartime. A holding of breath, a suspension between what was and what might be. Scouts brought word of movements in the east. Darkness gathering, armies mustering. The slow, inexorable machinery of war beginning its terrible work. Rimuru spent those days in the gardens, or walking the borders of Rivendell's protection, or sitting in the libraries, reading texts written in languages that took conscious effort to decipher. Anything to avoid the silence that came when there was nothing to do but think about choices made and unmade, about power held in reserve, about the people walking into darkness, while the one who might light their path remained behind. On the 7th night after the fellowship's departure, Gandalf dreamed. This was unusual. Istari slept rarely, their minds too active, and their purposes too consuming to permit the kind of rest that mortals required. When they did sleep, their dreams were not the random firings of exhausted consciousness, but something deeper, more intentional, the mind processing truths too large to face while waking. Gandalf dreamed of light, not the warm light of sun or the cold light of stars, but something anterior to both. Light as it existed before there were eyes to perceive it, before there were shadows to give it definition. Pure radiance, patient and absolute. He stood if standing meant anything in this space, upon a plane that stretched in all directions without horizon. The ground beneath his feet was neither grass nor stone, but simply surface neutral and accepting. Above him, the light gathered without source, present in every direction at once, and before him stood an eagle, not one of the great eagles who served as messengers and allies to the wise. This was something older, vaster of form that borrowed the shape of eagle, the way a storm might borrow the shape of clouds temporarily, for purposes of communication while remaining fundamentally other. The eagle regarded him with eyes that held depths beyond measuring. It did not speak, did not need to speak. Understanding flowed between them in the wordless way that dreams permit, carrying meaning that would take hours to express in language, but arrived complete in a single instant. The stranger is noted. Permission is granted. One breath only. Then the terms must be met. Gandalf woke in his quarters in Rivendell. The dream's clarity fading, but its message remaining sharp as forged steel. He lay still for a long moment, processing what had been given and what had been withheld, understanding the shape of the permission and the price it would exact. An eagle had come. That meant the Valar watched, or at least one among them, cared enough to send a sign. But the message had been spare, offering no explanation, no elaboration. Just the simple acknowledgement that what Rimuru represented had been seen by powers older than the world's breaking. One breath. That was all the stranger would be allowed. One intervention at the level of Arda's deep structure. One moment of touching the fabric beneath the fabric. And then, what the dream had not specified. But Gandalf knew enough of the Valar's methods to understand that consequences would follow, and those consequences would not be gentle. He rose dressed and went to find Rimuru. The stranger was exactly where Gandalf expected, in the eastern gardens, where dawn came first and the view stretched toward distant mountains. Rimuru stood facing that direction, motionless, in a way that suggested deep thought rather than meditation. "You're troubled," Gandalf said, approaching without ceremony. "The Fellowship has been gone 7 days," Rimuru replied without turning. 7 days of walking into danger, while I stand in safety and tell myself it's wisdom rather than cowardice. It's neither. It's necessity. The wizard came to stand beside the stranger, his own gaze following the line of mountains. "The ring would use you if you came near it. We established this. Your absence from the quest is not failure, but prudence." "I know." The words came flat, drained of conviction. Knowing doesn't make it easier. Gandalf was quiet for a time, weighing how much to reveal, how much to hold back. The dream had been clear, but dreams from the Valar were not commands. They were permissions, opportunities, choices laid before the free peoples to accept or reject as their will dictated. "I had a vision last night," he said finally. "A dream, though I suspect it was more than simple dreaming." Rimuru turned to face him, and the stranger's expression carried the first genuine interest Gandalf had seen in days. "What kind of vision?" "The kind that comes when the powers beyond this world choose to make their will known, or at least choose to make their awareness known." Gandalf's hand tightened on his staff, the ancient wood warm beneath his palm. "An eagle came to me. Not one of Gwaihir's folk, but something. Older. Larger. It spoke without words." "What did it say?" "That you have been noted. That permission is granted for one intervention, a single moment of acting upon Arda at the level you are capable of reaching. And that after that moment terms must be met." Gandalf paused, studying Rimuru's reaction. "I do not know what those terms are. The vision did not specify, but I know enough of such permissions to understand they are not given lightly, and their prices are always paid in full. Rimuru went very still. One breath. That's what it said. One breath only. How did you? Gandalf stopped, understanding dawning. Tom Bombadil. He spoke to you of breath and measure. He said something about one breath, one note, and then going. Rimuru's voice was distant, remembering. I thought it was just Tom being Tom, cryptic and strange. But if your vision used the same phrasing, then it was not random poetry but actual instruction. Gandalf felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Tom knows things, sees things. Perhaps he saw this moment coming even then when you first fell into this world. They stood in silence as the implications settled. Rimuru had been permitted to exist in Middle-earth, tolerated by powers that might have expelled the stranger immediately. But that tolerance came with conditions, and those conditions were being spelled out now in visions and cryptic warnings. One intervention, one moment of using power at the scale Rimuru was truly capable of. And then departure, exile, or something worse. The terms would be met, whatever those terms proved to be. When? Rimuru asked. When would I use this permission? I cannot say. Perhaps never. Perhaps the permission is itself a test to see if you can carry the knowledge of what you could do and still choose restraint. Gandalf turned to face the stranger directly. But if I were to guess, I would say it will come when the Fellowship faces a threat they cannot overcome alone, when the quest itself hangs by a thread, when one breath might be the difference between hope surviving and darkness claiming all. That's a heavy burden to carry. Knowing I have one chance to act one moment to make a difference, and if I choose wrong or waste it on something less than crucial, then you will have to live with that choice as we all must live with ours. The wizard's expression softened slightly. But consider this, the fact that permission was granted at all suggests that the Valar, or at least one among them, believe there will come a moment when your intervention is not merely helpful, but necessary. They do not grant such permissions idly. Rimuru moved to a stone bench, sitting with visible weariness. This world keeps teaching me the same lesson in different ways. Power means nothing if its use corrupts the purpose. Strength means nothing if it robs others of choice. And now capability means nothing if you don't know when to use it. Not quite, Gandalf corrected gently. Capability means everything, but only if you can carry it without using it until the moment arrives when use is the only choice left. That is perhaps the hardest burden of all, to be able and to wait. The sun had fully risen now, burning away the morning mist and revealing the valley in all its carefully preserved beauty. Elves moved through the gardens on their timeless errands. Water fell in cascades that had been engineered to sound like music. Everything spoke of order preservation, the slow work of maintaining light against encroaching shadow. I'm afraid, Rimuru admitted quietly. Not of the enemy. Not of the Nazgul or Sauron or even the Ring. I'm afraid that when the moment comes, I won't recognize it. That I'll hesitate or act too soon or choose wrong and people will die because I couldn't judge correctly. Welcome to the burden that every leader, every warrior, every person who holds any measure of power has carried since the world was young. Gandalf sat beside the stranger, his ancient joints creaking slightly. Fear of making the wrong choice is the only thing that keeps us honest. Those who never fear their decisions are those most likely to make catastrophic ones. How do you bear it? You've carried this kind of responsibility for longer than I can imagine. How do you keep going without being crushed by the weight? The wizard was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. When he spoke, his voice carried a weariness that age alone could not account for. I bear it badly, if I'm honest. I make mistakes. I doubt. I lie awake wondering if the path I've chosen will lead to salvation or ruin. But I continue because the alternative is surrendering to despair, and despair serves only the enemy." He turned to look at Rimuru, and in his eyes there was a kinship born of shared burden. "You ask how I keep going. I keep going because others depend on me to keep going. Because Frodo walks toward Mordor carrying a weight that would crush most beings, and if he can take one more step, then I can take one more step. Because the world is full of people doing impossible things with quiet courage, and I would be ashamed to offer less." Rimuru absorbed this, and something in the stranger's expression shifted. Not resolution exactly, but a kind of acceptance. The fear would not go away. The doubt would remain. But beneath both was a growing understanding that these were not weaknesses to be overcome, but necessary companions to any power worth wielding. "Thank you," Rimuru said, "for trusting me with the vision. You could have kept it to yourself." "I could have," Gandalf agreed, "but that would have been cruelty disguised as protection. You need to know what has been granted and what will be asked. You need time to prepare for the possibility that the moment will come, and time to accept that it may never come at all." They sat together as the morning advanced toward noon. Two beings from different creations, united in the strange fellowship of those who carry power they dare not use freely. Around them, Rivendell maintained its patient beauty, unaware that within its borders sat someone who had been granted permission to touch the world's deep structure once and only once. In the east beyond sight, but never beyond awareness, the fellowship walked deeper into shadow. Gandalf's presence among them was both protection and target, a beacon that drew the enemy's attention, even as it offered hope to the companions. The wizard knew this, accepted this, and continued. Because that was what Istari did. They walked into darkness not because they were certain of victory, but because someone had to, and they had been chosen for the task. And now, Rimuru had been chosen as well. Though for what task and at what cost remained shrouded in the kind of uncertainty that the Valar seemed to prefer. They gave permission, but not instruction. They offered opportunity, but not guarantee. They watched from beyond the circles of the world and waited to see what the free peoples would do with the choices laid before them. "I should return to my studies," Gandalf said, rising with the slow care of one whose body was older than it appeared. "There are texts in Elrond's library that may shed light on this permission precedence, perhaps, or warnings. The Valar have granted interventions before, though rarely, and never without exacting their price." "And I should—" Rimuru trailed off, uncertain what preparation looked like for a moment that might never arrive. "Continue as you have been," Gandalf advised. "Learn what Middle-earth has to teach. Grow stronger not in power, but in judgment. And when the moment comes, if it comes, trust that the preparation you've done, the mistakes you've made, the lessons you've learned, the humility you've earned, will guide you better than any amount of strategic planning." The wizard departed, leaving Rimuru alone in the gardens with the weight of permission and the burden of waiting. Above, eagles circled on thermals invisible to earthbound eyes, watching with attention that might have been simple animal behavior or might have been something more. The stranger sat and thought about one breath, about what could be accomplished in a single moment of unleashed capability and what would be lost in the accomplishment. About the gap between being powerful and being wise, and how that gap could only be bridged by walking it step by careful step mistake, by painful mistake. Until finally, if you were lucky, if you were attentive, if you were humble enough to keep learning, you reached a point where you could be trusted with the terrible responsibility of decisive action. Rimuru was not there yet, knew it with absolute certainty. But the permission had been granted anyway, which meant either the Valar had more faith in the stranger's capacity for growth than the stranger did, or they understood that true wisdom only came from making choices with real consequences and living with whatever followed. Either way, the burden was now carried. One breath, One intervention, one chance to make a difference or make things catastrophically worse, and no way to know which it would be, until the moment arrived and the choice was made and the terms came due. In the east, the fellowship walked on. In Rivendell, the stranger waited. And in the space between action and patience, between power held and power wielded, the true test began not of strength but of character, not of capability, but of judgment, not of being able to act, but of knowing when action served something larger than the actor's need to feel useful. The world turned. The war advanced, and permission once granted could not be ungiven. Now, it was simply a matter of seeing whether the one who carried it would prove worthy of the burden. Time alone would tell, and time in Middle-earth had a way of demanding its answers sooner than anyone expected. The call came on the 33rd day after the Fellowship's departure, carried by an eagle whose wings blotted out the sun. Here the Windlord descended into Rivendell's courtyard with news that turned Elrond's face to stone. The Fellowship had been scattered. Gandalf had fallen in Moria, taking a Balrog into the abyss with him. The remaining 8 had reached Lothlorien, wounded and diminished, with Sauron's servants closing in from all sides. The quest hung by a thread thinner than spider silk. Rimuru heard the news in the library and felt something fundamental shift in the stranger's chest. Not grief, there would be time for grief later, if there was a later. What shifted was the weight of waiting suddenly transforming into the weight of necessity. Gandalf had fallen. The wizard who had been both guide and restraint, both teacher and warning. The one who understood what Rimuru was and what dangers that understanding represented. Gone into darkness, leaving behind only the memory of gray robes disappearing into mist, and a final instruction about one breath, one intervention, one chance to matter. The stranger found Elrond on the high terrace staring east with an expression that carried the accumulated sorrow of ages. "The Fellowship will continue, Elrond said without turning. They must. Even without Gandalf, even scattered and pursued, they must press on because the alternative is worse than any individual death. I know." Rimuru's voice was steady, but something beneath it thrummed with barely contained energy. But they need time. Space to regroup, to heal, to find their path again. And right now, Sauron's will is pressing on them from all sides, using the Nazgul and worse things to drive them into mistakes. "You cannot help them directly. The ring." "I know," Rimuru interrupted gently. "I can't go near the ring. Can't fight the wraiths without fighting what they serve. But I don't need to fight them." The stranger turned to face Elrond fully. "I need to do what Gandalf's vision granted permission for. One breath. One intervention. Not to win the war, but to give the Fellowship the chance to fight it on their own terms." Elrond's ancient eyes studied the stranger with an intensity that felt like it could read down to the soul's foundation. "You understand what this will cost." The permission came with terms. Terms that were not specified, which means they will be harsh when they come due. "I understand." And in saying it, Rimuru did understand with a clarity that went beyond intellectual knowledge into the realm of certainty. But Gandalf fell buying time for the quest to continue. "The least I can do is honor that sacrifice by giving them the chance to use that time wisely." "Then you have chosen." Elrond's voice carried no judgment, only recognition. "The Valar grant their permissions for moments precisely like this, when the brave have fallen and the desperate must rise to take their place. Go, do what you came to do, and may the music remember your name kindly when the terms come due." Rimuru left Rivendell before dawn the next day, traveling east with a speed that bent the normal rules of distance. Not flying, the stranger's power did not work that way in Middle-earth, but moving through the landscape in a manner that suggested the space between points was negotiable if you understood which rules could be questioned. 3 days to reach the borders of Mordor. 3 days watching the land grow darker. the vegetation sparser, the very air heavier with malice that had seeped into stone and soil over long ages of the enemy's habitation. And with each mile, Rimuru felt Arda pushing back. This was not the gentle resistance the stranger had encountered when shaping the haven. This was active rejection, the world's deep structure recognizing something that did not belong and attempting to expel it. The closer to Mordor, the stronger the pressure. Like walking through water that grew thicker with every step until simple forward motion required conscious effort. But the permission held. Whatever the eagle in Gandalf's vision had granted, it created a space for Rimuru to exist here, to act here for precisely the span of one breath. After that, the terms, but not before. The stranger stopped at a ridge overlooking the plateau of Gorgoroth, where Barad-dûr rose like a blasphemy against the sky. The dark tower pulsed with malevolence, its stones singing a counter-melody to the music that had shaped creation. And wrapped around those stones, woven into their very substance, was the will that called itself Sauron. Rimuru could see it now in a way that had not been possible before. Not with eyes saw only the physical, but with the sense that operated on the level beneath matter, where reality was not fixed, but negotiated, where the rules that governed existence could be examined. And if one was powerful enough or foolish enough, questioned. What the stranger saw made the breath catch. Sauron had not simply built a fortress. The Dark Lord had anchored himself into Arda's fabric, using the ring as a spike driven deep into the world's foundation. From that anchor point, he projected his will outward in filaments invisible to normal sight, each one carrying a fragment of the hunger that defined him. These filaments connected to the Nazgul, to his armies, to the very stones of Mordor, creating a network that amplified his influence far beyond what mere physical presence could achieve. He had turned himself into a structural component of Middle-earth's current state. To defeat him was not merely to kill a powerful being, but to excise a cancer that had grown into the body's vital systems. And the Fellowship carrying the ring toward Mount Doom were walking directly into the heart of that network with no understanding of its true scope. Rimuru knelt on the barren ground and placed both hands flat against stone that had forgotten what it was like to support life. "I'm sorry," the stranger whispered to Arda itself, to the music that had sung this world into being, to whatever powers watched from beyond the circles of creation. "I know this will hurt, but I don't know another way." Then Rimuru began to sing, not with voice, not even with the echo of great sage that had shattered against the ring's presence. This was something deeper, drawn from the core of what the stranger had been before Middle-earth, before the fall into wrongness, before the lessons in restraint and humility. This was power operating at the level where Rimuru could touch the foundations of reality and ask them very politely to consider an alternative arrangement. In Rimuru's world, this would have been trivial. A recalculation of universal constants, a slight adjustment to the rules governing existence, executed with the precision of mathematics and the certainty of one who had ascended to the level where such adjustments were possible. But this was not Rimuru's world. Here reality had been composed by the Ainur in harmony with Eru's vision. Here every stone and stream knew its place in the greater song. Here to change the rules meant harmonizing with music that had been playing since before time began, and doing so as an instrument that was fundamentally out of tune with the orchestra. The dissonance was immediate and catastrophic. Arda screamed, not audibly. The sound existed on frequencies that transcended mere noise, a wail of protest as the world's deep structure felt itself being questioned by something that should not have the authority to question. Mountains trembled. The earth around Mordor buckled, not breaking, but flexing like a drumhead struck too hard. In Rivendell, Elrond staggered and caught himself against a pillar, feeling through the very bones of the valley that something unprecedented was occurring in the east. In Lothlorien, Galadriel looked up from the mirror with an expression of wonder and horror, combined, seeing with her deeper sight the moment when an outsider touched the music and made it skip a note. And in the depths of Barad-dûr, Sauron felt for the first time in millennia something that might have been fear. Rimuru pulled, not at the stones, not at the land, at the network itself, at the filaments of will that Sauron had woven into Middle-earth's structure. The stranger found the anchor, the spike driven deep, where the ring's essence merged with Arda's foundation, and did not try to remove it. Removing it would have destroyed the world as surely as Sauron's victory would have. Instead, Rimuru made it visible, the unseen world, where spirits dwelt and power operated, according to rules older than matter, suddenly became seen. For a span of time measured not in minutes, but in the single held breath that the permission allowed the veil between worlds thinned to transparency. And everyone, every mortal, every elf, every dwarf within 100 leagues saw what Sauron had done. They saw the filaments spreading from Barad-dûr like roots from a poison tree. They saw how those filaments connected to every servant of the shadow, channeling the Dark Lord's will directly into their minds and hearts. They saw the Nazgul for what they truly were, not independent beings, but fingers of a single hand, extensions of a consciousness that dwelt in a ring and used them as its implements. Most importantly, they saw the hunger, the ring's appetite laid bare for all to witness. Not a desire for conquest or domination in the conventional sense, but a need to subsume, to make everything part of itself, to eliminate the very concept of separation between self and other. It wanted to be everything, and in being everything, to make the concept of individual choice meaningless. The revelation lasted perhaps 3 seconds in objective time. But those 3 seconds burned themselves into the consciousness of all who witnessed, indelible as scars. And then Rimuru let go. The stranger collapsed, and the world snapped back into its normal configuration with a violence that shattered stone and sent shockwaves rippling across the plateau of Gorgoroth. The unseen retreated behind its veil. The filaments became invisible again. But their presence was now known, and knowledge once gained could not be forgotten. Rimuru lay on barren ground, gasping, and felt Arda rejecting what had just been done. The world's immune system recognizing the stranger as a foreign element that had just violated its deepest structures began the process of expulsion. It started as pressure, then as pain, then as a fundamental wrongness in every cell, every particle of the stranger's being. Middle-earth was pushing Rimuru out not with malice, but with the simple biological imperative that removes splinters from flesh. The stranger tried to stand and fell, tried again, and managed to reach hands and knees. The landscape had begun to blur, edges becoming indistinct, as if the world was losing interest in rendering this particular observer's reality with full detail. But it had been enough. Across Middle-earth, those who had seen the revelation understood now what they faced. Understood that fighting Sauron's servants was fighting Sauron himself. That the ring was not a tool to be claimed, but a trap to be destroyed. That the quest the Fellowship carried was not merely important, but essential. The only way to sever the connection between the Dark Lord and the reality he had corrupted. In Lothlorien, Aragorn looked up from tending his wounds and felt the weight of kingship settle on his shoulders with new clarity. He had seen the network, had understood in that moment of revelation exactly what he would be fighting when he finally claimed his throne. The knowledge was terrible, but it was also freeing. No more doubt, no more uncertainty, only the clear understanding of what must be done. In the mines, beneath Erebor dwarves who had debated whether to march to war, felt their debate end. They had seen what Sauron would make of their halls if given the chance, every stone a cell in his vast nervous system, every forge a factory for his will. There was no neutrality possible against such an enemy. And somewhere on the borders of Mordor, moving through shadow and desperation, Frodo felt the ring grow suddenly heavier on its chain. It knew. It knew that its nature had been exposed, that the seduction would be harder now that people understood what they were being seduced toward. The ring's whispers grew more desperate, more insistent. A voice that had counted on operating unseen and now found itself revealed, but also lighter. Because Frodo, looking at his companions, saw in their faces the same knowledge he carried. They had all seen what he bore, had all understood what would happen if he failed. And in that shared understanding, the burden became fractionally more bearable, not because it was lighter, but because he knew he did not carry it alone. Rimuru managed to sit up, vision swimming. The stranger could feel it beginning the price of the permission, the terms that had not been specified because they were built into the very structure of what had just been attempted. Arda was rejecting the stranger. Not violently, not with intent to destroy, but with the simple and absolute certainty that this being could no longer exist within the boundaries of creation as the music had defined them. The world was saying very politely and very firmly, "Leave." From the east, a presence stirred. Sauron, his network exposed and his advantage of operating unseen, stripped away, turned his full attention toward the ridge where Rimuru knelt. The Dark Lord could not see what the stranger was that remained mercifully obscured, but he could see what had been done, and his rage was a palpable force. The sky darkened. Not with clouds, but with malice, with the focused hatred of one who had counted on fear and ignorance as his primary weapons and now found both diminished. Rimuru felt that attention like a physical weight and knew there was no defense against it. Not here, not in this weakened state, not while Arda itself was trying to expel the stranger from its bounds. Then eagles came, 3 of them descending from clouds that moments before had been empty. Gwaihir led them, his eyes fierce and knowing. He landed beside Rimuru with a gentleness that belied his size, and in his bearing there was recognition of what had been sacrificed. "The Valar send their regards." The eagle said voice carrying harmonics that suggested he spoke for powers beyond himself. "And their gratitude. You have done what none of the firstborn could do, shown the enemy's hand without destroying the board. Now come. Your time in Middle-earth ends, but not your story." Rimuru tried to speak and found words failing. The rejection was accelerating reality, becoming thin around the edges, the stranger's form beginning to lose cohesion. Gwaihir lowered himself to the ground, making mounting possible even for one whose strength was failing. "Hold fast. We fly not to Rivendell, but beyond to the shores where the world thins, and passage becomes possible for those who can no longer stay." With the last of fading strength, Rimuru climbed onto the eagle's back. The other 2 eagles positioned themselves as escorts, and together they launched into air that had become hostile, flying west with desperate speed. Behind them, Sauron's will lashed out, but the eagles were swift and their purpose clear. They carried one who had paid the price for intervention, and even the enemy could not deny the terms that had been set. They flew for 2 days and a night, never landing, never resting. Rimuru drifted in and out of consciousness, feeling the world grow progressively less solid, as if the stranger's existence was becoming more suggestion than substance. When they finally descended, it was to shores that existed at the edge of Middle-earth, where the sea met the sky in a line that was not quite horizon and not quite boundary. Elven ships waited there, the vessels that carried the firstborn into the west, when their time in mortal lands ended. But there was something else too. A shimmer in the air. A crack in the fabric that separated one creation from another. The same wrongness through which Rimuru had first fallen into this world, now opening again to permit departure. Galadriel stood on the shore, having traveled by ways known only to the wise. Beside her, Elrond, his expression grave. And between them, somehow impossibly stood a figure in gray robes that should have been lying broken at the bottom of a chasm in Moria. "Gandalf," Rimuru whispered, or tried to whisper. The voice came out barely audible. "Not anymore," the wizard replied, and his robes were no longer gray but white, and his staff was no longer worn wood but something that seemed to catch and hold light from sources that did not exist in the mortal spectrum. I fell, yes, and I returned changed. The Valar are not without mercy, even when they are stern. They sent me back to finish what must be finished. He approached Rimuru, where the stranger lay on the sand, his strength finally exhausted. You kept the Fellowship alive. You gave them the knowledge they needed. You used your one breath well. The price, Rimuru managed, is being paid, Galadriel said gently. Arda cannot hold you now. You are being returned to the space between creations, where those who do not belong to the music must eventually go. But you have left your mark. The song will remember that a note fell from outside and harmonized just long enough to make a difference. The crack in reality widened, and through it Rimuru could see something that might have been home, or might have been somewhere else entirely. The stranger tried to stand, and found that standing was no longer quite possible. Physicality itself was becoming optional. Will they succeed? The question came desperate, needing an answer, before departure made answers impossible. Will the Fellowship destroy the ring? I do not know, Gandalf said honestly. But because of what you showed them, they understand what they fight for. They know the cost of failure and the necessity of success. You have given them the greatest gift possible, clarity. What they do with that gift is theirs to choose. Elrond stepped forward, placing something in Rimuru's failing hand. A leaf from the Malorn trees of Lothlorien, silver and gold, imperishable. So you remember, the Elf Lord said quietly, that you were here, that you mattered. That the free peoples of Middle-earth will carry your sacrifice in their songs, even if they never know your name. The crack widened further. Rimuru felt the pull now irresistible as tide. The stranger looked at the three who had come to witness the departure wizard Elf Lord, and she, who was oldest and wisest of all, who remained in mortal lands. Thank you, Rimuru said, for teaching me, for trusting me, for letting me matter even for so brief a time. You were the note Eru allowed, Galadriel replied. Brief, yes, but necessary. And in being necessary, you were beautiful. The pull became absolute. Rimuru's form began to dissolve, pulled back toward the crack that led elsewhere. The stranger held the Malorn leaf and felt it remain solid, even as everything else became uncertain. The last thing seen before the world fell away entirely was the three figures standing on the shore, hands raised in farewell. Not grieving, not celebrating, simply witnessing the departure of one who had come from outside and stayed just long enough to make a difference. Then the crack closed. The shore was empty, save for three who stood in silence, watching the space where impossibility had briefly been permitted. Far to the east, in the depths of Barad-dûr, Sauron raged. His network had been exposed. His advantage had been stripped away. The fear he had cultivated now competed with understanding, and understanding was far more dangerous to his cause than simple terror. And further still beyond the borders of maps and the reach of malice, the Fellowship walked on. They did not know what had been done for them, did not understand the price that had been paid to give them clarity. But they walked with new purpose, new understanding, and the shared knowledge that what they carried must be destroyed, no matter the cost. One breath had been taken, the terms had been met, and Middle-earth, though diminished by the departure of one who had briefly harmonized with its song, was stronger for the intervention. The war would continue. Blood would be shed. Grief would come to those who deserved better. But the balance had shifted ever so slightly in favor of hope. And sometimes in a world darkening toward its final trial, slightly was enough. The world adjusted. In the hours following Rimuru's departure, Middle-earth settled like a house after a great wind, creaking and groaning as it found its new equilibrium. The revelation could not be unseen. The knowledge could not be forgotten. Every soul who had witnessed the moment when the unseen became visible carried that understanding forward into whatever future remained. In Minas Tirith, Denethor sat alone in his tower and stared into the Palantir with new horror. He had long gazed into that seeing stone, communing with what he believed was mere surveillance of the enemy. But now he understood what he had truly been doing, touching the edge of Sauron's network, letting those filaments creep into the corners of his mind. The steward of Gondor looked at his own hands and wondered how much of his despair was his own, and how much had been carefully cultivated by a will that wanted him broken. The knowledge might destroy him, or it might save him. Time would tell which. In the forest of Fangorn, the Ents stirred from their long pondering. Treebeard, who had lived through ages and learned patience as a fundamental truth, felt something shift in the roots of the world. The revelation had shown him what Saruman truly served, what the White Wizard had become in his corruption. Anger, slow to build, but terrible once roused, began to burn in the heart of the forest. Trees would march to war. Not soon, for Ents did nothing hastily, but inevitably, and in the darkness of Mordor itself, in chambers deep beneath Barad-dûr, where even light feared to venture, Sauron contemplated his exposure. The Dark Lord had not known vulnerability in millennia. His power was vast, his will indomitable, his servants numberless. But power built on fear required that fear remain nameless, shapeless, a terror too great to comprehend, and therefore impossible to resist. The stranger had given that terror a shape, had shown the mechanism by which it operated, had transformed the unknowable into the merely terrible, and terrible things once understood could be fought. Sauron's rage manifested as a psychic pressure that drove his servants to their knees across 3 kingdoms. But beneath the rage was something the Dark Lord had not felt since the last alliance had cut the ring from his finger: uncertainty. The network remained. The filament still connected him to his Nazgul, his orcs, his corrupted lands. But now his enemies knew to look for them, knew that destroying him meant severing those connections, knew that the ring was not power to be claimed, but a parasite to be excised. In the unseen world, where consciousness operated without the burden of flesh, Sauron gathered his will and reached out toward the west, seeking the one who had done this to him. He found only absence. The stranger was gone, expelled by the very world that had briefly tolerated the intrusion. But Sauron could trace the shape of what had been there, could sense the edges of a power that operated on principles he did not fully understand, could feel the residue of an intervention that had required permission from forces he had thought long withdrawn from Middle-earth's affairs. The Valar had moved. Not directly, never directly, they were bound by oaths older than time not to reshape the world with force. But they had permitted another to act, and in that permission they had declared their interest in the outcome. Sauron pulled back his consciousness, retreating to the fortress of his will. He could not undo what had been revealed, could not restore the fear that came from ignorance, but he could adapt. He could use the very knowledge of his network against those who thought understanding it made them safe. In the unseen, where thought and will were the only currencies that mattered, the Dark Lord began to weave new strategies. The Fellowship felt the change without understanding its source. They had been walking through shadow and desperation, harried by orcs and haunted by the weight of their quest. But after the revelation, something shifted in the air around them. The darkness remained, but it no longer felt absolute. The pursuit continued, but it lacked the coordination it had possessed before, as if the mind directing it had been forced to divide its attention. Aragorn led them with a certainty he had not possessed before. He had seen the network, understood how deep Sauron's corruption ran, and in that understanding found clarity about his own path. He would be king, not because he desired it, but because someone had to stand against a power that operated through subjugation and control, and that someone needed to embody the opposite leadership through consent, strength through service. Legolas and Gimli, who had been allies of necessity, found their friendship deepening. They had both witnessed the revelation, had both seen what the enemy would make of their peoples, if given the chance. The old grievances between elf and dwarf seemed suddenly small when measured against the hunger they had glimpsed in that moment of clarity. And Frodo walked with the ring hanging heavy on its chain, but walked nonetheless. Because he had seen what his companions had seen, and he knew now that his burden was not his alone to understand. They could not carry it for him, that remained his curse and his choice. But they could carry the knowledge of what failure would mean, and in that shared understanding, the weight became bearable. Sam watched Frodo with new purpose. The gardener had always been loyal, but loyalty transformed by understanding became something stronger commitment. He had glimpsed what the ring truly was, and he would die before letting it claim the one person in all the world who mattered most to him. They walked on through lands that grew progressively darker, but they walked with purpose that no amount of shadow could fully extinguish. Behind the veil of normal sight in the space where spirits moved and power operated according to older laws, something unprecedented occurred. Sauron, reaching through his network to crush the Fellowship before they could reach Mount Doom, encountered resistance. Not from the Firstborn, whose power in the unseen was considerable, but familiar. Not from the last remnants of Numenor's glory, whose wills were strong but mortal. The resistance came from the shape that had been left behind when Rimuru departed a hole in the structure of Middle-earth, where something that did not belong had briefly existed. That hole was closing slowly as Arda healed itself from the intrusion. But it had not closed yet, and in the space of its not-quite closure, there remained an echo of what had been done. Sauron pressed his will against the Fellowship, seeking to drive them into error, to turn them against each other, to make the ring-bearer stumble into despair, and found his will deflected, not blocked, not countered, simply redirected as if the space through which he was projecting his influence had developed an unexpected angle. His attention slid past the Fellowship like water past a stone, unable to focus with the precision he required. The Dark Lord pulled back, analyzing what had just occurred. The stranger's intervention had not merely revealed his network, it had damaged it. The exposure had introduced friction into a system designed to operate without resistance, had made visible what should have remained hidden, and in that visibility had reduced efficiency. Sauron could still act, could still command his servants, still project terror, still orchestrate the war he had spent centuries preparing. But he could no longer do so with the absolute certainty of one operating in complete darkness. His enemies could see the strings now, and seeing them could begin to cut them. The realization brought a response that shook Mordor to its foundations. Towers cracked. Orcs fled from their master's rage. And in the heart of Barad-dûr, a consciousness that had dominated the Third Age with inexorable will, understood that the game had changed. Not lost, not yet, but changed in ways that required new calculations, new strategies, new assessment of what victory would demand. In Rivendell, Elrond stood in his library and felt through the ancient bonds that connected him to the land itself. How Middle-earth was adjusting to what had been done. The world was healing, yes, but it was healing around the scar of intervention, and that scar would remain long after the wound closed. Future generations would study this moment, would argue about whether the stranger's action had been justified, whether the price paid was worth the benefit gained, whether permission from the Valar constituted mandate or merely tolerance. But Elrond, who had witnessed the rise and fall of kingdoms, who had seen the patterns of history repeat themselves in endless variation, knew that such arguments missed the essential point. Rimuru had been given a choice and had chosen correctly. Not perfectly. There was no perfect choice in a world where every action carried consequences, both intended and unforeseen. But correctly in the way that mattered most, by using power to preserve the possibility of others choosing freely, rather than imposing a solution that would have robbed them of choice entirely. That was worth remembering, worth honoring, worth carrying forward into whatever future the war would permit. The elf lord closed the book he had been pretending to read and went to find Galadriel. She would be in the gardens, he knew, standing where she could look east and see with her deeper sight how the patterns were shifting, how the balance was adjusting, how the note that had fallen into the world's song was slowly, inevitably fading back into silence. He found her exactly where he expected, standing beneath a malern tree that had been grown from seeds she had brought from Lothlorien. "It's done," Galadriel said without turning. "The stranger is gone beyond recall. The wound begins to close, and we are left to face what comes next with the knowledge that we are not entirely alone, even when we feel abandoned." "The Valar watch," Elrond agreed, coming to stand beside her. "More than watch. They permitted. They sanctioned. They chose to allow an outsider to act when they themselves remained bound by oaths not to intervene directly." Galadriel's voice carried a wonder that her ancient years could not diminish. "I had thought them withdrawn from Middle-earth's fate, content to let us rise or fall by our own choices. But this suggests they care more than they show and watch more closely than we know. Does that comfort you?" She was silent for a long moment, her gaze distant. "I do not know. To be watched is both reassurance and burden. To know that our choices matter to powers beyond ourselves adds weight to every decision. But yes, I think it comforts me. Better to struggle knowing that we are seen than to fight in isolation, believing ourselves forgotten." They stood together as the sun descended toward the western horizon, two of the eldest beings in Middle-earth, contemplating the actions of one who had existed among them for barely a season and yet left a mark that would endure long after the current crisis passed. "The songs will remember," Elrond said finally. "Not the stranger's name, perhaps, not the details of what was done. But they will remember that when darkness seemed absolute, something came from outside and reminded us that the world was larger than the enemy's will, that there were powers and possibilities beyond what Sauron could comprehend or control." "Yes," Galadriel agreed. "And in the remembering, there will be hope. Not the false hope that refuses to see danger clearly, but the real hope that recognizes peril and chooses to stand against it anyway, because standing is the only choice that preserves what makes standing worthwhile." The sun set. Stars emerged, those same stars that had watched the first age and would watch whatever ages followed. Indifferent, perhaps, but also faithful. They would keep shining regardless of what transpired below, and in their constancy there was a kind of mercy. In the east, the war continued. Armies marched. Cities prepared for siege. The Fellowship pushed deeper into shadow, carrying a burden that grew heavier with every step. But they walked knowing what they faced. Walked with clarity, purchased at a price they would never fully comprehend. Walked because someone who had no stake in Middle-earth's fate had chosen to intervene anyway, not to win the war, but to give those who fought it a genuine chance to win it themselves. In the unseen world, the echoes of Rimuru's action continued to ripple outward. Sauron adapted his vast intelligence, already devising new approaches that would account for the revelation. But adaptation required time, and time was the one resource his enemies needed most. The balance had shifted, not decisively, not permanently. The war could still be lost. The Fellowship could still fail. Darkness could still triumph over light. But the possibility of another outcome had been strengthened, and possibility once kindled was remarkably difficult to extinguish entirely. Gandalf the White returned from death, and changed by that returning, stood alone on a high peak and looked toward Mordor with eyes that saw more than the physical. He could perceive the network still, though fainter now, its edges blurred by the damage done to it. The wizard understood what Rimuru had achieved better than most. The stranger had not solved the crisis, had explicitly avoided solving it, knowing that a solved crisis was a stolen victory, a paternalistic imposition that would have corrupted the very freedom it sought to preserve. Instead, Rimuru had done something harder and more valuable, created the conditions under which those who lived in Middle-earth could solve the crisis themselves with full knowledge of what they faced. And full agency in choosing how to face it. That was wisdom. Real wisdom, not the false wisdom that proclaimed itself savior and demanded gratitude for imposing solutions. "Safe journey," Gandalf murmured to the empty air, to the stranger who could no longer hear, but who had earned the blessing nonetheless. "You learned what you came to learn. And in learning it, you taught us something we had forgotten, that power's highest purpose is making itself unnecessary." The wind carried his words away into the gathering darkness, and the wizard turned his attention back to the war that required his participation. There was work to be done, battles to fight, hope to kindle in hearts that had begun to despair. But he would carry with him the memory of one who had held ultimate power and chosen not to use it, who had possessed the capability to reshape reality and elected instead to give reality the chance to reshape itself. In the end, that would matter more than any victory won through force. And in the silence that followed Rimuru's departure, in the space where a note from outside had briefly harmonized with Middle-earth's song, the music continued its endless composition. Changed, yes, marked by the intervention carrying the scar of permission granted and price paid, but continuing nonetheless, because that was what the music did. It played on through discord and harmony, through darkness and light, through all the ages of the world and whatever lay beyond. One note had fallen, one breath had been taken, one stranger had chosen wisely, and the song remembered. Years passed as they do. The War of the Ring reached its terrible crescendo. Armies clashed on the Pelennor fields. The Witch King fell to blade and prophecy. Towers burned and kingdoms trembled, and the fate of the age hung suspended between hope and despair. And at the heart of it all, a small hobbit climbed a mountain, with his companion carrying a burden that had broken stronger souls, sustained only by friendship and the stubborn refusal to surrender that small folk sometimes possess in greater measure than the mighty. Frodo stood at the crack of doom with the ring in his hand, and in that moment he failed. The ring claimed him, whispered its final seduction, made him believe that he could wield it wisely, that his suffering had earned him the right that power in service of good was still power in service. But Sam was there, and Gollum was there, and the struggle that followed was ugly and desperate, and nothing like the clean victories of legend. Frodo lost a finger. Gollum fell dancing into fire with the ring clutched in his remaining hand. And the weapon Sauron had forged to dominate all life dissolved in the mountain's heart, screaming its hunger even as it melted into nothing. The Dark Tower fell. The network that had been damaged but not destroyed finally severed entirely, its anchor gone, its purpose unmade. Sauron's will scattered on winds that would carry it nowhere, a consciousness that had dominated an age reduced to whispers that would fade over centuries into less than memory. Middle-earth was saved, but not because a stranger had solved the crisis. Not because power from outside had swept in and imposed victory. The Fellowship had walked their path, paid their price, made their choices, and in the making of those choices had preserved the very freedom that made victory meaningful. Rimuru had given them clarity, yes, had shown them what they faced and made the invisible visible. But the walking, the suffering, the choosing, that had been theirs alone. And that made all the difference. In the years that followed, when the age turned and the Fourth Age began its slow unfolding, those who had witnessed the revelation spoke of it rarely and with care. It had become something like a holy memory, too precious and too strange to be shared casually. Aragorn crowned king in a city rebuilt from siege and sorrow, kept in his private chambers a leaf from a malern tree. He never explained where it came from, and those who knew did not ask. But sometimes when the burden of kingship grew heavy and the temptation arose to impose order through force rather than earn it through service, he would look at that leaf and remember. Remember that someone had held power enough to reshape the world, and had chosen instead to preserve the world's right to shape itself. Remember that the highest use of strength was making strength unnecessary in others. Remember that wisdom looked like restraint far more often than it looked like action. Legolas and Gimli, whose friendship had become legend, sometimes spoke together of the moment they had seen Sauron's network laid bare. Neither could fully articulate what they had witnessed, but both agreed on this. They had glimpsed the face of true tyranny, and it was not brutality or cruelty, but the sincere belief that everything should be unified under a single will. Against that horror, their people's old grievances seemed almost quaint. Yes, dwarves were stubborn and elves were haughty, but both peoples valued the right to be themselves, flaws, and all over the false peace of enforced harmony. That shared value became the foundation of a friendship that would outlast the age. Sam Gamgee returned to the Shire, and determined never to speak of most of what he had endured, kept his own small memory. He could not have explained what he had seen in that moment of revelation. The mechanics were beyond him, and the metaphysics beyond his caring. But he understood the essential truth. Some things were worth fighting to preserve, even when fighting seemed hopeless, because surrender meant losing not just the battle, but the right to be the person who chose to fight. He planted gardens, raised children, lived a life that was ordinary in every way, except the profound gratitude with which he approached each ordinary day, knowing how close that ordinariness had come to being swallowed by something that would have made even the concept of gardens meaningless. Gandalf, who alone among the Fellowship truly understood what Rimuru had been and what the intervention had cost, carried the knowledge like a lantern in dark places. When younger races asked him about the great powers and whether they had abandoned Middle-earth to its fate, he would smile and tell them about a stranger who had come from outside and learned to love the world enough to leave it. "The Valar have not abandoned us," he would say. "They simply trust us more than we trust ourselves. They watch. They permit. And in the rarest of moments when the world hangs by a thread, they open paths for those who can walk them at terrible cost. That someone walked such a path for our sake should tell you how much we are valued, even in our stumbling." And Frodo, who had borne the ring and been broken by it, who had saved the world and lost himself in the saving, understood better than most what Rimuru's choice had meant. The stranger could have taken the ring, could have solved everything with overwhelming force, could have spared Frodo the journey and the wound and the failure at the mountain's peak, but in doing so, would have robbed Frodo of the choice to carry the burden of the right to fail and be rescued of the dignity that came from struggling toward an impossible goal and nearly reaching it through sheer determination. When Frodo sailed into the West, seeking healing in lands beyond the circles of the world, he carried with him the understanding that some gifts were given not in action, but in restraint, not in solving, but in trusting others to solve, not in dominating, but in stepping back. He never learned the stranger's name, never knew where Rimuru had come from or where the departure had led. But he knew gratitude, and he knew that somewhere beyond the walls of the world there existed powers that understood mercy looked like permission rather than protection. That was enough. The songs that were written in the Fourth Age made no mention of Rimuru. This was not erasure, but respect. The stranger had asked for no glory, had sought no place in history, had intervened specifically to preserve others' agency. Rather than claim credit for their victories, to write the intervention into the songs would have been to diminish what it meant to make it about the helper, rather than the help, the power, rather than the preservation of others' power to choose. But in the private archives of Rivendell, in texts that only the wise would read, and fewer still would understand, a record was kept. It spoke of a note that fell from outside the music, of permission granted and price paid, of one who came bearing power enough to break the world and instead chose to give the world a chance to save itself. And in the margins, in Gandalf's own hand, a single line that captured everything the lengthy text could not. They learned what they came to learn, and in learning it taught us what we had forgotten. Beyond the circles of the world, in spaces that had no geography and time that moved according to rules that would baffle mortal minds, Rimuru emerged from the crack between creations. The stranger's form was uncertain for a time, fluctuating between states as reality tried to decide what category this being belonged to. The Malorn leaf remained solid, the only piece of Middle-earth that had been permitted to cross the boundary, a gift that defied the normal rules because it carried weight beyond the physical. Eventually, the stranger's shape settled. Not quite the form that had entered Middle-earth, and not quite the form that had existed before. Changed by the experience, marked by the choices made, carrying scars that would never fully heal, but which told a story worth the pain of its telling. Echo of the song, shattered by contact with the ring, reformed slowly. Different now. Less certain, more cautious, carrying a humility born of discovering that not all phenomena could be analyzed, not all challenges could be solved through superior information. "Where are we?" Rimuru asked the empty space, not expecting answer. But answer came anyway, though not in words. A sense of rightness, of being in a place that was neither home nor exile, but something in between. A way station, perhaps. A space for those who did not belong to any single creation, but had learned enough from multiple creations to deserve continuation. Did it work? The question emerged, desperate, needing confirmation that the price had purchased something of value. Did they succeed? No answer this time. Whatever power governed this space between spaces was not inclined towards spoilers. The stranger would have to trust that the intervention had mattered, that the revelation had given the fellowship what they needed, that the balance had shifted far enough toward hope to make the outcome something other than inevitable darkness. Trust. That was the lesson, wasn't it? Not power, not capability, not the certainty that came from being able to impose solutions, but the trust that others given the chance would rise to meet challenges in ways that preserved their dignity and honored their agency. Rimuru looked at the Malorn leaf, silver and gold and imperishable, and felt something that might have been peace. "I was the note Eru allowed," the stranger said to the silence. "Brief, necessary, and now ended. That's enough. That has to be enough." The space between spaces offered no argument, no comfort, no assurance. Just the vast neutrality of existence continuing, regardless of whether any individual found meaning in their participation. But Rimuru had found meaning. Had learned that power mattered less than wisdom, that strength mattered less than restraint, that the greatest gift was often the gift of stepping back and letting others discover their own strength. Middle-earth would continue its turning. Ages would pass. The songs would be sung and forgotten and sung again in different words. The fourth age would give way to a fifth and then a sixth and onward into futures that mortal imagination could not compass. And somewhere in those futures, when scholars puzzled over the patterns of the past, they might notice an irregularity in the third age's ending. A moment when the balance shifted without clear causation, when Sauron's network faltered without explanation, when the Fellowship gained clarity that seemed to arrive from outside the normal flow of events. A few might guess at the truth. Fewer still would believe it. And those who believed would argue whether it had been right or wrong, justified, or overreaching mercy or interference. But Gandalf's marginal note would remain waiting for those wise enough to understand it. They learned what they came to learn, and in learning it taught us what we had forgotten. In the space between creations, Rimuru held the Malorn leaf and remembered a world where the music composed reality and discord threatened to unmake it. Remembered people who fought with quiet courage against overwhelming darkness. Remembered the wizard who had taught restraint, the elf lady who had tested intention, the hobbit who had carried an unbearable burden with dignity that broke the heart. Remembered standing on a ridge, overlooking Mordor and choosing to help without solving, to act. Without dominating, to use power in service of others' power, rather than as a replacement for it. The stranger had been changed by Middle-earth. Profoundly, irreversibly changed. The lessons learned there would shape every choice that followed in whatever worlds or challenges came next. Power was not the answer. It was merely the question. What will you do with capability when restraint serves better than action? The stranger had answered that question once in a world that did not belong to the one answering. And the answer, the choice to give rather than take to empower, rather than dominate to trust, rather than control, that answer would echo through whatever existence remained. The Malorn leaf pulsed with gentle light, carrying memory and meaning across the void. And in that light, Rimuru found something unexpected: forgiveness. Not from Middle-earth, the world had simply expelled what did not belong, as any healthy organism would. But from the stranger's own heart, forgiveness for the mistakes made in other worlds, for the times when power had been used poorly, for the moments when certainty had overridden humility. Middle-earth had taught that lesson in the gentlest way possible. Not through punishment, but through example. Not through suffering, but through witnessing the suffering of others who bore it with grace. The note had fallen. The song had adjusted. The stranger had departed. And in the departing had learned what it meant to harmonize with a music not your own. To contribute without overwhelming to matter, without being essential. That was enough. More than enough. It was everything. In Middle-earth, the fourth age dawned with hope, tempered by memory of cost. The free peoples rebuilt what war had broken, carrying forward the understanding that freedom required constant choosing, constant vigilance, constant willingness to stand against powers that would make choosing unnecessary. They did not speak the stranger's name because they did not know it. They did not sing the stranger's deeds because those deeds had been crafted specifically to avoid the spotlight of history. But they lived the stranger's legacy every day, in every choice, to preserve agency over security, to honor struggle over imposed solution, to trust that people given freedom would sometimes fail, but in failing would remain themselves. That was the gift, not salvation, not victory, not the easy answer that solved all problems. Just the gift of being allowed to face their challenges with clear eyes and free will, to fail or succeed on their own terms, to write their own stories, rather than have stories written for them. The note had fallen from outside the music. It had harmonized for precisely one breath, and then it had left carrying with it the understanding that sometimes the greatest power was knowing when to become powerless, when to step back, when to trust that the song would continue without your voice adding to its chorus. Middle-earth sang on, and somewhere beyond the circles of the world, a stranger who had briefly joined that song smiled, held a silver gold leaf, and rested in the knowledge that for one perfect moment, power had been used for something better than power. For freedom, for choice, for the simple, profound right of all beings to determine their own fate, even when that fate included struggle and doubt and the very real possibility of failure. That was the note Eru had allowed. Brief, necessary, beautiful, and now complete. Middle-earth has no slimes. So what would happen if a slime who enjoys peaceful farming life from another fantasy world suddenly wandered into it? Rimuru Tempest possesses power on the level of a creator god, yet he chooses not to disturb the already fragile balance of Middle-earth. To him, the beings of this world are little different from children struggling, flawed, and vulnerable. Because of that, he initially sees himself as a neutral presence rather than a savior. Staying true to his compassionate nature, Rimuru builds a temporary refuge for civilians caught in the path of war. He does not seek control, conquest, or glory, only to protect those who have nowhere else to go. But as the machinery of war expands, even this refuge becomes a target. Forced to confront the reality that neutrality has limits, Rimuru decides to intervene, but not by answering violence with greater violence. Instead, he chooses a different path. A very Rimuru choice.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. And be sure to turn on notifications so you won't miss our future videos. Thank you for watching and we will see you next time.